United States. In fact, in its own 2025 World Drug Report, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as a key trafficking route in the Western Hemisphere for illegal drugs, predominantly cocaine, entering the United States and increasingly Europe. As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations, rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions. In fact, over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, destabilizing their neighbors in the region and creating the world's largest refugee crisis. Members of this council, colleagues, the United States wants a better future for Venezuela. We believe a better future for the people of Venezuela and for the people of the region and the world is stabilizing the region and making the neighborhood that we live in a much better and safer place. And this is why millions of Venezuelans that have fled this brutal regime are celebrating and cheering around the world as this body pontificates, including those celebrating are including in my home state of Florida, where hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have fled this regime's brutality. I want to reiterate, President Trump gave diplomacy a chance. He offered Maduro multiple off-ramps. He tried to de-escalate. Maduro refused to take them. President Trump made it clear that the narco-terrorism must stop, and yet it continued. The United States will not waver in our actions to protect Americans from the scourge of narco-terrorism and seeks peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative.
Mike Waltz, the US representative to the UN Security Council. Jeremy Bowen is still with us, our international editor. Pick up that point that he made there, Jeremy, about Venezuela being used as a base for Iran, for Hezbollah, for Cuba. In fact, almost half of those killed in the weekend operation were Cubans who were part of Maduro's personal protection team.
Yeah, it's been well documented that they have strong relations. That whole movement, not just under Maduro's time, but under Hugo Chavez, his predecessor, the man who established the regime, who, as he was dying, was being of cancer, I believe, was being treated in Cuba. There are lots of connections between Cuba and Venezuela. The Americans raised the issues of Iran, of Hezbollah, as raising these boogeymen. I have not seen convincing data about the role of either of those in the country, or how great or how small it may be, because I would say that they've got a lot of stuff happening at home, and the chances of them being able to reach out around the world, I think, are not great. He also spoke greatly about drugs, and Venezuela as a narco state, Maduro as some kind of drugs kingpin. Now, the evidence appears to be that one picks up on all of this is that, yes, indeed, drugs pass through Venezuela, but if the U.S. really wanted to go go after the sources of drugs that are sold on the streets of the United States, then cocaine, that would be coming out of Colombia mostly, and fentanyl, a great deal of that coming out of Mexico. And what he didn't mention was the subject that Donald Trump mentioned time and again in his news conference at Mar-a-Lago at the weekend, and that is the subject, Venezuela's oil, and his desire to get his hands on it on behalf of American oil companies and also on behalf, of course, of profits for the U.S. economy.
Yeah, Panama currently speaking at the Security Council, who of course have an interest in this. There's some precedent with the arrest and prosecution afterwards of Manuel Noriega. The question that Mike Walsh asks, Jeremy, is what sort of organisation is this if it confers legitimacy on an indicted narco-terrorist? The problem for the US administration is that they're about to confer legitimacy on his vice president, on someone who was part of the same regime that he denounces.
Yeah, the US argument has got big holes in it. The regime is intact as far as we can see. What they've done is they've taken away the head of it, but his number two is now being sworn in as, I guess, the new head of it. The armed forces are intact. Their commanders are intact. The whole network of patronage, of corrupt deals, of those civilian militias that have been armed and of the other armed criminal groups that operate in Venezuela, all of those things are still intact. Democracy is not being mentioned as an objective, even though there is, they've mentioned that an election has been swept away, but the man who was swept away, the guy who claims to have won the election, is in Spain. And he wasn't even mentioned by Donald Trump in his particular news conference. The American arguments for what they've been doing is essentially that this man deserves to be arraigned, sentenced, punished, and that what they did was therefore legitimate. Now, I think a lot of people who are concerned about whether or not international law was broken by the Americans, and of course the evidence is that it very much was, can also say that Maduro was a bad man. It's possible to, on one hand, say in one part of your head, well, Maduro was a bad man, but I have great doubts, you might argue, about the way the Americans went about doing this. Because the idea is that for states to function in a way that isn't simply the survival of the strongest and the fittest, there needs to be a series of rules to regulate their behavior. And that's what emerged after the Second World War, after decades of that survival, after decades of competition between countries that were militarizing, and the end, of course, the two world wars of the 20th century that they wanted to avoid happening again. And that structure is what is being eroded. Well, the remains of that structure are quite rapidly collapsing, actually, is probably more accurate. And that's why people are so concerned about all of this. And this is why, you look at the European countries involved, look at the French, look at the British, they're absolutely concerned about the abuses of international law and the way that structure isn't really functioning anymore. But at the same time, of course, they are very worried about trying to criticize Donald Trump because they know that he gets angry and he's vengeful on if he's criticized, if he's stopped. One more thing, Christian, about this whole idea of the rules-based order that I was trying to talk about when Mr. Hegseth started speaking there, the ambassador at the UN, is not Hegseth, sorry.
Mike Walsh.
Yeah, I beg your pardon. Is that a lot of the world has thought for a long time that the whole concept of a rules-based international order is complete nonsense, because essentially they were seen as Western rules for Western countries that would be applied differently in different circumstances, and that friends of the West and members of the Western alliance would get away with things, and then those rules would be turned against other countries that weren't in the club. And there's a lot of veracity towards all of that. So for a lot of the world, this whole idea of the rules-based order, a lot of countries in the so-called global South have thought for a long time that it's a load of nonsense.
Yeah, which very much was the point that the Russian representative was making just a short time ago. Jeremy, really fascinated to talk to you. Thank you very much for that. We're continuing to watch the scene in Caracas where they are swearing in the new assembly, as well as, of course, the new interim president, Delcy Rodriguez. Let's speak to the Financial Times Latin America editor, Michael Stott, who's been part of a team that's been putting together a profile of Miss Rodriguez. It's a really fascinating read. Thank you for your patience, Michael, while we got through all of the various things that are happening in New York. So let's start with what sort of conversations were taking place with Rodriguez and those closest to her before the operation this weekend.
Hello, Christian. Yes, well, I think there's been something cooked up here between Rodriguez and the Americans for some time. They've been in conversations about an alternative to Maduro, an alternative government, one that will be headed by Delcy Rodriguez. And I think the idea is that this is not necessarily the definitive solution. I think we should be careful against sort of concluding that what we see now in Venezuela is the end state that Trump wants. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, yesterday was fairly clear that this is the initial step and that further steps will follow. And so I think we have to sort of see Rodriguez being sworn in today in the light of that. She's being sworn in as an interim replacement, but this doesn't necessarily mean she's going to be running the country a year or two from now.
She's a revolutionary herself. I mean, her father founded a Marxist political party. By all accounts, she's a committed Chavista, albeit moderate compared to some of the other hardliners around her. Why is she, for the moment, acceptable to Washington?
She's their best bet for holding the country together and delivering on some of the things Washington wants to see, which is an end to alliances with Moscow, Beijing and Tehran, an end to drug trafficking from Venezuela, and access for American oil companies, which are some of the things Trump stressed most strongly. And I think the feeling in Washington, Christian, is that really anybody else at the moment is not in a position to deliver. The Democratic opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, has legitimacy, popular legitimacy. It was the true winner of the 2024 election, but they're out of the country, the two most visible leaders, Maria Corina and Edmundo Gonzalez, and they're just not in a position to take over. Delcy, on the other hand, and her brother Jorge, who's important to mention, the head of the National Assembly, next in line to succession, they're people with their hands on the levers of power in Venezuela.
Jeremy was mentioning that really the people who were there around Maduro are still in place. He's talking specifically about Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who is head of the armed forces, and Diosdado Cabello, who is Minister of the Interior, also in charge of the militias known as the colectivos. So they are two very powerful men who are still in place. The question is whether she can do the bidding of Donald Trump and keep them on side.
That's a key question, absolutely, Christian. I think the next few days and weeks are going to be crucial in determining whether or not she is able to carry out that very delicate balancing act of keeping on side the sort of regime hardliners, the people who control the security forces, the colectivos and the army, and also on the other doing enough to keep the Americans sweet. And Trump has been extremely clear that if he's not satisfied with progress, there will be further military action. So she's in an extremely difficult, some might say, impossible position. And I think the other thing I'd underline, Christy, is the country's extremely fragile. You've decapitated a regime. You've taken away the man who held all the pieces together for 13 years. There's a real question whether the pieces will now all crumble into bits, or whether Delcy can keep the whole thing holding together.
Just very, very quickly, if you could. I mean, she's still under European sanctions, Rodriguez, and also US sanctions, so she's limited in what she can do.
Yes, she's on a very tight leash. She's been given only a very limited sort of time, I think, to deliver, and she's going to be watched very carefully. I don't think this is something where the Trump administration is saying we're placing all our trust in you. They're just saying you're the person who's there, you're the one we're going to deal with for now, and you better deliver very quickly or else.
Really interesting. Michael Stott, thank you very much indeed for that. John Sutherworth is still with me in the studio. Donald Trump has reversioned the Monroe Doctrine, which was a creation of the 19th century to ward off European interests in America's backyard, as the Donroe Doctrine. The big difference, and Jeremy was alluding to it, is that they're not trying to coerce the leaders that are in place. In this instance, they're replacing him.
They are, although, I think it's very interesting what Michael Stott was saying there about the idea that if, as we heard the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying, if the hope here, in his words, is what matters is a peaceful transition to democracy, as we heard the speaker from Venezuela, from Venezuelan Transparency, telling the UN Security Council if what matters is the release of political prisoners, well, removing Maduro, but business as usual with the rest of that regime isn't going to achieve any of those things. It is early days, as Michael Stott said there. We don't know what the end game is. But, I think although Mike Walls, the US ambassador to the UN, paid lip service to the lack of democracy, again, very interesting to hear him say that the real problem here was the world's largest oil reserves in the hands of America's enemies. And I think that goes to Jeremy Bowen's point that what we're really seeing here is an American flex of military and political muscle for its own interests. Democracy, if it's there at all, is taking a back seat. And that's why I think Russia and China, they may be concerned about some of this, but also in this there may be something for them to welcome. They would certainly like a world in which regional power is exercised in their own interests in their own backyards.
John, for the moment, thank you very much. We're looking at Latvia at the UN Security Council, who are currently speaking. Next up is Denmark. So we'll maybe take you to that when the Danish representative speaks, because, of course, there are such big implications for Greenland. We're going to take a very short break. You're watching BBC News.
Hello there, good afternoon. Well, there's plenty of lying snow around, particularly across the Highlands. Icy conditions too for many, with more snow showers to come in the forecast. Although it will be slightly less cold tomorrow, that bitter air is set to last as we head through the rest of the week, and there'll be sharp frost through the overnight periods as well. For the rest of the day, though, some wintry sunshine for many. Still coastal showers running down through North Sea facing coasts and from parts of Western Wales into southwest England. More snowfall across eastern Scotland too. But overnight tonight, we'll see the coastal showers fade away. Some less cold air moving in from the northwest, but still snow on the leading edge. These will be the temperatures. Probably the coldest across Scotland first thing through the evening, because the air will turn a little milder as that system works its way in. But first thing tomorrow morning, some freezing fog towards the south. The risk still of some snow flurries across the Midlands into East Anglia through the day, but there will also be some sunshine. A lot of this will be falling as rain. Temperatures still on the very chilly side, so low single figures, but out towards the west we could get to 7 or 8 degrees Celsius here, so notably less cold. But that bitter northerly wind returns as we head through Wednesday. It is a rather blustery day. Again, we'll see that Arctic air with the risk of some more snow showers at times. Here's the outlook. Take a look at the BBC Weather app for the full forecast for your local area.
We're going inside the world of entertainment TV with the people behind some of the biggest hits.
Celebrity Traitors, Hunted, Pointless, all are formats enjoyed by millions around the world. But how do you go from an idea to a blockbuster?
It's all on the Media Show on BBC News.
I'm here in Los Angeles to speak to Arden Cho. She is the voice of Rumi from K-pop Demon Hunters. We sat down with her as part of BBC Global Women to speak about her career in Hollywood, her next projects, the success of K-pop Demon Hunters, and of course, those Oscar rumours.
Africa's biggest football show is underway. From the stadium to the streets, the BBC is on the ground in Morocco to bring you the colour, the drama, the passion of the Africa Cup of Nations. Join us on BBC News or follow the latest online or via the BBC Sport app.
The wash of blue, that colour of nature, the seas, the sky, it is so immersive.
A lot of the fantasy that I have read is unsatisfactory for me because it's not interested in psychologist, not interested in how people think or feel. I'm interested in people and the way they grow.
If you are fully in the moment, you are totally responding in the moment to everything that's happening. And when you're doing theatre, that can change night after night. It's a live, living, breathing, active thing.
I suppose to the outside world, the most visible part of the London Film Festival is the red carpet. And this year it brought out some of the biggest names in the film industry.
I think there is too little architecture in this world. We desperately need places that bring peace, that bring positivity.
Inspiring arts and culture. Watch on iPlayer.
My family learned English by listening to and watching BBC News. I want to be for others what the BBC was for us, a trusted source of stability and hope. I'm Marianne Mashiri on The World Today for BBC News.
Welcome back. We're continuing to follow events in New York at the UN Security Council. We're going to take you straight to New York because the Danish representative is speaking.
As the legitimate president of Venezuela, following the lack of transparency and integrity in the 2024 presidential elections, which failed to meet basic democratic standards. In Maduro's attempts to cling to power, his authoritarian regime grew increasingly oppressive. His regime bears responsibility for widespread and systematic violations of human rights against his fellow citizens, and he should be held accountable. The victims of the Maduro regime's alleged crimes against humanity have to be heard. The Venezuelan people have a right to democracy and self-determination exercised through peaceful, inclusive, and credible democratic processes, free from fear of political persecution, intimidation, or repression, and external political interference. This includes the rights of Venezuelans alone to determine their political, economic, and social future without coercion, pressure, or manipulation by external actors. No state should seek to influence political outcomes in Venezuela through the use or threat of force or through other means inconsistent with international law. Venezuela's future can be decided only by the Venezuelans. We call on all parties and stakeholders to come together for a negotiated and peaceful transition to democratic rule in a process led by and owned by Venezuelans. At this critical and uncertain time, it is imperative that all parties fully respect human rights and international law. Denmark remains committed to supporting Venezuela and the aspirations of its people on its path to lasting political stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I congratulate Somalia on the assumption of the presidency of the Council for the month of January. And I thank our briefers for their remarks. Colleagues, the Venezuelan people have suffered for years. This Council now meets at a pivotal moment for Venezuela's future. Maduro's actions created extreme levels of poverty, violent repression, and failing basic services. His regime's rule precipitated a displacement crisis affecting the whole region. The United Kingdom has long been clear that Maduro's claim to power was fraudulent. To date, Venezuela's National Electoral Council has failed to publish the full results of the July 2024 presidential elections, and independent domestic and international reports also observed significant irregularities and a lack of transparency. President, the United Kingdom wants to see a safe and peaceful transition to a legitimate government that reflects the will of the Venezuelan people. They deserve a government which reflects their vote at the ballot box and delivers a more stable, prosperous future for all Venezuelans. Finally, President, the United Kingdom reaffirms its commitment to international law and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. These foundations are essential for maintaining global peace, security, and the rule of law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and now give the floor.
So we just heard comments from the representative for Denmark and the UK. Interestingly, quite brief remarks, no mention of Greenland from the Danish representative, although she did talk about the need for Venezuela to be given the right to democratic freedom, self-determination. The rules-based order, she said, should be upheld. No country should intervene in another by force, perhaps a veiled reference to what Donald Trump has suggested for the annexation of Greenland. Very short and brief remarks from the Deputy Ambassador from the UK, James Kariuki. Of course, Jeremy Bowen was telling you a little earlier about the diplomatic tightrope that Sir Keir Starmer and his ministers have been walking in the last few days, and I think you've got a flavour of that in the brevity of that statement. We are continuing to focus as well on events in Manhattan, where in the next hour, Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, will be arraigned. Let's go to the courthouse. Claire Richardson is outside for us. A really important moment, as we've been discussing in the last few hours, Claire, in this transition from a political process to a legal process.
Absolutely. Remarkable scenes outside the courthouse here in Lower Manhattan, where we are expecting Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, to be attending that arraignment hearing in just under half an hour at this point. And we can also say one of the questions that had been open until now was what kind of legal representation President Maduro would be retaining. We now have reports coming in that he has retained Barry J. Pollack as his attorney. Now, he represented Julian Assange, a highly respected lawyer. He was involved in brokering that deal that freed the WikiLeaks founder. So that is the latest lines coming to us here in New York City. I also want to bring in our correspondent, Michelle Fleury, who's here with me with the very latest. Michelle, maybe you can just talk us through what we can expect to happen at the top of this coming hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. One of the key questions everyone had was who was going to represent Nicolás Maduro, his wife and son. Remember, there are two others charged as well. Senior officials within the administration. And so now we have at least part of that answer. And the fact, as you say, that he has represented Julian Assange before obviously brings a wealth of experience in what is going to be a very tricky case, a sensitive case, one that raises lots of legal questions, not least, what will Nicolás Maduro do? Will he try, for example, and plead immunity? He is the sovereign head of a state. So that is another question I think we're going to be waiting to see. Of course, the other thing to remember is when he appears in that building behind you, in a short while from now, he doesn't necessarily have to enter a plea. But that is also another thing people are going to be watching for. What does he say? And also, what does the government say? Will they reveal more about the charges against Mr. Maduro and his family? Again, we know drug-related, weapons-related. Will we get more details?
We had that indictment coming out on Saturday that laid out the charges. But indeed, in this arraignment hearing, we know that they are going to lay those out to Maduro and his wife once again, potentially get that plea in. The judge considering whether or not to, or how to deal with the pre-trial detention. It's hard to imagine there would be any kind of bail in this case. But just give us a sense of what we can actually expect today, because this will certainly be a really long legal proceeding, right?
I mean, I think you're right. We're not expecting a trial anytime soon. It could be potentially a year before there is a trial. And so if that is the case, what do you do in the meantime? Where is he going to be held? As you point out, he was brought to MDC in Brooklyn, a detention centre that has something of a reputation for not necessarily having the best conditions. It has seen some sort of very prominent inmates in the past. When I think about people like the rapper P. Diddy, there was Ghislaine Maxwell, the Sam Bankman-Fried from the crypto fraud. Now it is housing Nicolás Maduro. Will he stay there in detention while he waits? Obviously, I suspect that will be one of probably the first orders of business that we'll hear about today, is that question of detention. Will he be moved? Will he have to stay there? That is probably something that you would assume his lawyers would be pushing to try and get settled as quickly as possible. The other question is resources. Remember, the US government has said that Nicolás Maduro has profited handsomely from this, has billions of dollars in wealth. Will he be able to access that for his defense? That money is held elsewhere, so therefore, in theory, under the law, the US wouldn't be able to kind of seize that. So what happens? Can he access that and use that towards his defense? I think that's also one of the other big remaining questions.
Yeah, we are expecting top legal talent, both for the prosecution now, also with these reports coming in that Barry Pollock has been retained as Maduro's attorney. I think it was interesting, some comments we just heard from the U.S. ambassador to the UN during this Emergency Security Council meeting that they've been holding on the request of Colombia about the United States' actions in Venezuela. And he was really making, first of all, the U.S.'s argument that this is about tackling what they call narco-terrorism, a law enforcement issue, but also arguing that Maduro is an illegitimate leader, which is going to likely be something that Maduro's attorneys are going to be focusing on in this case as well, right?
That matters, and the reason it matters from a legal standpoint is about the basis of arrest. The US has said that their justification is that this is actually just carrying out an arrest for someone who has broken US law, and whether or not that happens on US soil, that is therefore legitimate. But under international law, some would argue you can't just go into another country and seize a leader in the middle of the night. And so that point of, is he the leader or not? Was he a legitimate leader who was acting with the protection that comes with being, holding that office and the kind of protections that running a government offers you? That will also have an impact and a bearing on the government's case. But there is precedent. And I would point to sort of the leader of Panama, Manuel Noriega, who was kind of taken into custody under similar circumstances, faced similar charges, and was sentenced and found guilty and put in jail. I think that legal precedent is something you would expect the Justice Department to lean on heavily. And interestingly, the point of law that sort of this revolves around comes back to a 1989 memo that was written by none other than Bill Barr. You may recall he was, in Trump's first term, head of the Justice Department.
That's right. Now, I just want to paint a picture of the scene around us, Michelle. About 100 meters from the courthouse, you've got a few dozen protesters gathering, anti-war protesters. They're holding signs saying things like "No blood for oil," in addition to "Free Maduro." When it comes to the question of oil, these reserves that Venezuela is sitting on, it became pretty clear after Maduro was seized. Trump made very clear, even in the hours after, that this was at least partially to do with Venezuela's oil reserves. Just talk us through how that's factoring in here.
Yeah, so I think people don't always think about this, but Venezuela is sitting in the world's largest reserves of oil. But the point is they are still very much in the ground. They are very hard to access, but they are the world's largest supply. And so if you're thinking in strategic terms, one argument that people are making is that Donald Trump is doing this not just for oil, but also other critical minerals and metals, whether it's gold, other rare earths that exist within the country. Now, for years and years, as a business journalist, I've sort of covered a lot of Venezuela. I've visited it. PDVSA is the state-run oil company. Even over a decade ago, it was sort of suffering from underinvestment, and years of that have meant that getting that oil out of the ground is very difficult. So there are opportunities for American oil companies to kind of move in, but it's not a given. And the question is, will they want to make the kind of investment? Some people are saying it's tens of billions of dollars each year to try and invest in infrastructure to get this oil out. So when Donald Trump talks about, the cost of all of this will be paid for, coming from the ground, coming from oil or natural resources. Yes, those resources are there, but extracting them will be difficult, and it's unclear sort of how quickly a payoff could potentially come for the US for that.
And Michelle, when you look at the markets, I believe there's an oil glut at the moment. How will US companies be looking at, how valuable it would be for them to invest in this?
So there's a couple of things to remember here, that America obviously has shale oil. it's a different type of oil. It's sort of a lighter type of oil. And that is why they might be interested in Venezuela, which is crude oil, which is the sort of heavier, darker, thick stuff that kind of gets refined and put into your cars. And America has lots of refineries, if you think about the Gulf of Mexico, that could use this. But the price of oil matters in all of this because right now it's around $60 a barrel. Historically, that's not that high. I mean, when you think back to times in the past, we've seen it closer to $80 a barrel. And so the incentive for American companies to spend, as I say, billions and billions of dollars in a country where, it's unclear still at this point how stable it will be going forward. And if you're making an investment over 10, 20, 30 years, you want to know there's stability, that there's going to be a return. And at the point when you've got low oil prices, that doesn't provide much of an incentive, especially when you can sort of get oil through shale oil, for example, closer to home with kind of less question marks over it.
Michelle, thanks so much for your analysis. Really valuable insights today when speaking with our correspondent Michelle Fleury here right in front of the federal courthouse, where in just about 15 minutes at this point, we are expecting President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, to arrive for that arraignment hearing, their first appearance in U.S. court. For now, I'll hand that back to you in the studio, Christian.
Claire, thank you very much. We'll come back to you very shortly as events get underway there in Manhattan. But let's go to the Colombian-Venezuelan border, where Sumi Somaskanda is standing by for us. We're watching live pictures here from the National Assembly, Sumi, where we expect Delcy Rodriguez to be sworn in as part of these proceedings. We've seen a standing ovation for Nicolás Maduro. So business continues, but what sort of things have we heard from the Assembly in the last hour?
It's been really interesting, Christian. Of course, this process has gone through as expected, and we've seen a real show of unity, and you mentioned that standing ovation. I just want to read you a little bit of what we heard from the deputy who was speaking a little bit earlier, who was talking about what exactly the session was about and why they were going to be swearing in Delcy Rodriguez. They said the country is going through an extraordinary and complex situation. President Nicolás Maduro has been kidnapped by the United States government in a barbaric, deceitful, and cowardly fascist-style attack by Yankee imperialism. So that gives you a bit of a taste, Christian, of the type of messaging we're hearing from that National Assembly. This is a critical moment, isn't it? Venezuela plunged into uncertainty, into a vacuum of power after Nicolás Maduro was seized by the U.S. government, by U.S. forces. We know that the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, has now assumed, or is about to assume power officially as the interim president. But it was very important, this assembly, also to show the unity of the civilian government and the military. The military, as you know, Christian, incredibly important in Venezuela. The defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, and also the interior minister, Diosdado Cabello, two men who carry and wield so much power in Venezuela, have both to this point supported Delcy Rodriguez. That is the support she will need to be able to hold the government together and continue its daily functions. But at the same time, it is very clear that they are conducting this assembly under immense pressure from the United States. So these shows of unity, these words that we've heard that are in direct contrast to the messaging we hear from the United States, is really a direct message to Donald Trump himself, saying Nicolás Maduro has been kidnapped. Obviously, that will be watched closely in Washington. But at the same time, what Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has said is watch the actions, not necessarily the words. They want to see, once Delcy Rodriguez is sworn in, what does she end up doing? Does she end up, for example, ensuring that, as the Trump administration has said, drug trafficking is brought under control, or that the flows of migrants out of Venezuela are stopped? Those will all be a very tall task for Delcy Rodriguez at a time that is incredibly tense and tenuous for the country.
Sumi Somaskanda, thank you very much for that. Let's bring in Elizabeth Dickinson. She's the Deputy Director for Latin America at Crisis Group, which is an international think tank. Thank you for being with us. The point I was making to Claire Richardson outside the court is that the court appearance in many respects matters this afternoon, because it's an arraignment that moves the military operation over the weekend to a criminal justice process. How much will that be seen and witnessed by people there in Venezuela?
Well, I think it's a very powerful image, of course, and I think let's be clear about sort of where public opinion is falling down at the moment. I think there are many Venezuelans who are very relieved to see Maduro out of the picture. This, of course, being a person who was behind, who lost an election in 2024, declined to step down, who has been involved in repressing the opposition. And so certainly seeing him in court, I think, is a very powerful message. At the same time, there's a lot of doubt because the entire apparatus of his government remains in place in Caracas. And so including some of the hardliners who were involved in orchestrating those flawed elections and in crackdowns on protesters and opposition figures. I think there's a lot of questions among Venezuelans about sort of what the real aims are and whether there will be a transition that guarantees a role for the democratic process.
And when it comes to those military hardliners that you and Sumi are referring to, does power flow from them, or are they really... and was Maduro the keystone which held it all together? Does their position become weaker with him out of the picture?
You know, I think there's actually a risk of the opposite. I think there's a risk that the regime can consolidate. Some of the strongest pockets of power of Chavismo, of the government of Maduro, remain intact. And we can think of this government really as sort of a living organism with different parts that have different interests and power. And I think it's quite possible that now we see hard lines sort of come to the fore. Delcy Rodriguez finds herself, I think, in a really quite challenging situation where she will undoubtedly be receiving almost impossible orders from the United States and being looked to comply in a way that satisfies the White House. At the same time, I think that those same hardliners within the government will be pressing her to hold the line and really maintain the cohesion of the regime that has persisted through decades, really, of attempts to fracture it.
Elizabeth, stay with us because the Venezuelan representative to the Security Council is speaking. Let's listen to a bit of that.
The civilian population and assets. International human rights law has also been violated, particularly the right to life, personal integrity and security. Of particular seriousness is the kidnapping of the President of the Republic by the government of the United States of America, which constitutes a direct violation of an essential norm of the international legal order, namely the personal immunity of heads of state in office. This immunity is not an individual privilege. It is an institutional guarantee that protects the sovereignty of states and the stability of the international system. Its disregard not only affects Venezuela, but also sets an extremely dangerous precedent for all states represented in this chamber, regardless of their size, power, or alliances. Mr. President, General Assembly Resolution 3314 of the clearly defines as an act of aggression the bombing of the territory of one state by the armed forces of another state, as well as the invasion or occupation, even without formal annexation. The events we are denouncing here unequivocally fit this definition. In 2004, the International Court of Justice affirmed that occupation exists when a state exercises effective control, even without formal annexation or the continuous presence of troops. Security Council Resolution 242, for its part, emphasizes that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible, while General Assembly Resolution 2625 establishes that the territory of a state shall not be subject to military occupation as a result of the use of force in contravention of the UN Charter. Allowing such acts to go without an effective answer would amount to normalizing the replacement of law by might, while eroding the very foundations of the collective security system. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake, the credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can set itself up as the judge, party, and executor of the world order are also at stake. Mr. President, we cannot ignore a central element of this U.S. aggression. Venezuela is the victim of these attacks because of its natural resources. Our country's oil, energy, strategic resources, and geopolitical position have historically been factors of greed and external pressure. When force is used to control resources, impose governments, or redesign states, we are faced with a logic that harks back to the worst practices of colonialism and neocolonialism. Accepting such a logic would mean to open the door to a deeply unstable world in which countries with greater military capacities can decide by force the political and economic destinies of other states. This scenario not only threatens Venezuela, it threatens international peace and security as a whole. If the kidnapping of a head of state, the bombing of a sovereign country, and the open threat of further armed action are tolerated or downplayed, the message sent to the world is a devastating one, namely that the law is optional and that force is the true arbiter of international relations. Venezuela firmly believes in diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful coexistence among nations. That has always been our historical position, and it remains so today, even in the face of an aggression of this magnitude. It is precisely that commitment to peace, the one that was violated on the 3rd of January. Therefore, Venezuela urges the Security Council to fully assume its responsibility and to act in accordance with the mandate conferred upon it by the Charter of the United Nations. In that regard, we request, A, that the government of the United States of America be demanded to fully respect the immunities of President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores, as well as their immediate release and safe return to Venezuela. 2, that the use of force against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela be clearly and unequivocally condemned. Thirdly, that the principle of non-acquisition of territory or resources by force be reaffirmed. And 4, that measures aimed at de-escalation, the protection of the civilian population, and the restoration of international law be adopted. Mr. President, in spite of the seriousness of the events, Venezuela would like to inform this body and the international community that its institutions are functioning normally, that constitutional order has been preserved, and that the state exercises effective control over all of its territory. In accordance with our constitution, Executive Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is being sworn in as acting President of the Republic, thereby guaranteeing institutional continuity, stability, and internal peace. We wish to convey a message of serenity, confidence, and hope to the Venezuelan people. Venezuela is a nation that believes in peace, work, and dignity. Our commitment is to diplomacy.
Samuel Montada there, the High Representative for Venezuela at the UN Security Council, condemning the actions of the United States over the weekend as the worst practices of colonialism and neocolonialism. He said that the president should be released. That's unlikely to happen, I would suggest, and that the UN Security Council condemns in the strongest terms the force that was used to take him out of the country. Vanessa Boschluder, who's the Latin American Caribbean editor for BBC Online, is with us. It's good to see you. I want to pick up on a point that we were just hearing from one of our previous contributors before we went to that. She was talking about this invidious position that Delcy Rodriguez is in, fulfilling the wishes under threat from Donald Trump, while also staying the right side of the hardliners in Caracas. How hard is that going to be?
That's right. I think Elizabeth Dickinson made an excellent point there. I think that Delcy Rodriguez will have to show very quickly that she's willing to cooperate with the US. I mean, she has that big stick hanging over her. Trump said that if she didn't cooperate, she would face a fate worse than that of Nicolás Maduro. And there are things she could be doing to show goodwill. For example, she could release the more than 800 political prisoners who are still being held in Venezuela, and she could do that immediately. The Venezuelan government under Nicolás Maduro in the past weeks did release in one tranche more than 80 prisoners, a couple of weeks previously more than 70, without giving a reason. They just freed them. And so it is entirely in her power to free these 863, I believe is the latest count, political prisoners. But if she does that, that's likely to go down very badly with her Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, who was flanking her when she gave that very combative speech when she said that Nicolás Maduro had been kidnapped. Diosdado Cabello is a hardliner, and he has always been the one who has opted for jailing people, for making laws that will make it a crime to speak out in favor of, for example, the US actions such as the naval blockade, and imposing 20-year sentences. So very much a hardliner. And if that step is taken by Delcy Rodriguez, freeing more than 800 political prisoners, it would please the US, it would please the opposition, the families of those being held, but would create problems with Diosdado Cabello.
Yeah, it's a risk that she runs, isn't it, within the country? But clearly something that she's going to have to navigate quite carefully, given the threats that we've already heard from Donald Trump. We are continuing to watch events in New York, the events at the Security Council and the responses of the 15 members of that Security Council. But we're going to take you to Manhattan, where the arraignment of Nicolás Maduro is about to get underway.
You're watching our live coverage from here in Lower Manhattan. I'm just in front of the courthouse where President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores are scheduled for their first public court appearance just at this hour. That after being seized in the night from their home in Venezuela. Behind me, barricades are being put up by the New York Police Department. The world's media have gathered, and we've seen protests both from those who are protesting against war, also from those who are supporting Trump's actions in Venezuela. So today we're expecting this arraignment hearing. This is typically fairly procedural. In most cases, it wouldn't last longer than 15 or 30 minutes. It's where Maduro and his wife will be read their rights. The charges against them will be read out, and they would enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. We may also hear from the judge information about potential pretrial detention, whether bail would be granted. That seems nearly impossible in a case like this. But 12 o'clock here in New York City has come. This is the scheduled start of the trial. And as you can see, there is a lot of movement going on here at the courthouse behind me. I do want to bring in our correspondent, Michelle Fleury, who's been here covering the latest for us. And Michelle, maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit, describing the scene of what we've seen from these protests about 100 meters outside the court.
Yeah, I mean, you can hear the noise of the extra barricades police are putting up, and that's because the crowds really have grown in about the last half hour since sort of we've been here. I've seen more and more people, but also the singing and the chants have got louder and louder. On the one side, you've got people who are saying, "Free Nicolás Maduro." That is a smaller group. On the other side, you've got people who are basically saying thank you to Donald Trump, who want to see this process followed through, who want to see Nicolás Maduro charged. They're carrying Venezuelan flags. They've been singing chants along the way. And so it's sort of quite an atmosphere really out here. And I think it underscores the significance of this moment. I mean, you have the leader of Venezuela who is about to appear in the building behind us, in a federal courthouse to face criminal charges. We expect 4 counts related to drugs and weapons charges. And so I think perhaps not surprising that we're seeing sort of this amount of interest and noise and hubbub outside.
As you say, 4 counts: narco-terrorism, cocaine importation, possession of machine guns, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices. This is going to be a legal process that goes on for quite some time. As we've said, this is just the arraignment hearing today. But talk us through what we can expect to come out of this legal process based on what we already do know.
Yeah, so I think we're still waiting to find out on sort of the government side who are going to be the lawyers who show up. But certainly we're beginning to learn a bit more about who will be representing Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia. We know Nicolás Maduro is being represented by a gentleman called Mr. Pollock, who previously has represented Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder. That because a notice was filed a short while ago with the court, so that's how we know that. His experience will be significant, as you alluded to there. There are significant sort of legal questions that arise from this court. There you've got the siren sort of whizzing past us. It gives you a sense of how busy it is really right now outside this court. As for his wife, we understand she is being represented by Mark Donnelly. He is someone who used to work for federal prosecutors and was involved investigating for the Texas House of Representatives the case against the Attorney General there, Ken Paxton. So we're starting to see that kind of wealth of experience building up. I think there had been questions maybe a couple of hours ago, if you and I had talked then, where we would have been saying, is he going to have a court-appointed lawyer or would he have his own representation? Now we know the answer to that. The next question, of course, is what about detention? You know, where will he choose to will that be something that the lawyers try to fight immediately at this hearing? I suspect that will be one of the key things we'll be talking about.
Yeah, Michelle, we were talking earlier about those remarks we heard from the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Obviously, they're also holding this emergency session today here in New York, just a bit north from where we are in Midtown East. And he was making several cases. One, this argument about narco-terrorism, that this is essentially a law enforcement operation in Venezuela, but also making the argument that Maduro is an illegitimate leader due to those widely disputed recent elections that he's continued to stay in power since. And we don't have an exact sense of what the legal arguments will be, but that does give us some clues of the direction the government might be taking as it prosecutes, right?
Well, I think one of the questions going into today was, will Nicolás Maduro try to sort of make some immunity plea? He is the sovereign leader of the state, and so he could try and argue that. And on the US side, you've got the sort of case being made that, he was a questionable leader. They will try to say he wasn't a duly elected leader, that it wasn't a legitimate leadership. And so I think they will try to use that as part of their arguments against that push for immunity. So lots of legal questions, not just about the criminal charges here, but also there's still the unresolved international legal questions about whether or not sort of arresting him in this fashion was legitimate or not.
Absolutely, and we're hearing a lot of criticism from various countries at the UN about that. Michelle, just very briefly, tell us what we expect in the next few minutes.
Well, we're expecting them to come into court. The judge overseeing the case is Alvin Hellerstein. He is a 92-year-old with plenty of experience, and we'll wait to see what happens next.
That's right. Okay. Michelle Fleury, thanks so much for being with us in our coverage. So we are here in New York. You're live with our special coverage in New York City, where the courthouse behind me will see President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, appearing for their first appearance in U.S. court, an arraignment hearing in which they will be read their charges, in which they will enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, in which a judge may consider their pretrial detention options. It is quite a scene here in Lower Manhattan. You've got the world's media surrounding this court. Also, protesters gathering about 100 meters away, waving flags, many of them in support of Trump's actions in Venezuela. We've also seen anti-war protesters against that, some saying no blood for oil, that this is an illegal, this is against international law. But you can perhaps just hear how much traffic, how many people are in the area. There's so much international interest in this case. And I've been here chatting about it today with our correspondent, Michelle Fleury. She's across the latest. And Michelle, perhaps you could just share for us a little bit more about what we're expecting today, just for those who are just joining us.
Yeah, so there are 4 charges that are going to be brought and read out in the courthouse in the building behind us. Amongst them, charges relating to drugs and to weapons possession. What we know already from the 25-page indictment that was unsealed on Saturday is that the U.S. Justice Department is alleging that Nicolás Maduro and his associates worked with terrorist organizations, organizations like the Sinaloa cartel. They will allege that him and his officials also worked with others to try and basically bring drugs into the United States. Then there are also those weapons charges. Now, we've sort of never seen anything really like this, and I think that speaks to the atmosphere outside the courthouse right now. There are protesters here, both who want to see Nicolás Maduro freed, but also who applaud Donald Trump and the actions he's taken this weekend, who are singing chants in celebration. So a lot of kind of anticipation for this first court appearance of the Venezuelan leader here in a Manhattan courthouse.
So the stakes couldn't be higher, both for international law and for Maduro and his wife themselves. The narco-terrorism charge carrying a maximum of life in prison, potentially. So a lot of questions around here. We do expect top legal representation, both in the prosecution and from the defense, for President Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. Just talk us through the latest there.
Yeah, so one of the questions, waking up this morning was who would represent Nicolás Maduro? Would he have access to some of his assets? Remember, the US alleges that he has considerable wealth, some of it gotten from the sale, they allege, of drugs, profiting from that to Americans. And so the question is, would he have access to that and use that towards his defense? We don't quite know the answer to that, but in terms of whether or not he would have a court-appointed representation, we now know that's not the case, that he has, in fact, got representation from a gentleman called Mr. Pollock, who has previously represented Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder. So he has considerable experience of very sensitive cases. And this is going to be a very tricky case for lots of reasons, not least because, of course, we're talking about, the leader of another country. Also, his wife, represented by Mark Donnelly, again, a former federal prosecutor in Texas with plenty of experience.
Now, as you say, Maduro's lawyer is likely to argue that as a sovereign head of state, he is immune from prosecution. What do you make of the way this has been handled up until the point of this arraignment hearing that it was scheduled to begin just 10 minutes ago at this courthouse in Lower Manhattan? The seizing of Maduro and his wife in an overnight raid in Venezuela from their home, and the way that they were brought to the United States. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, this is, take a minute to sort of step back. This was an extraordinary event that we saw sort of in the middle of the night, 150 planes used to kind of take two people, essentially, not just any two people, obviously, but the leaders of the country, from Venezuela back to the United States under the cover of darkness, and then we saw them arrive at that detention center in Brooklyn Saturday evening. I think what is fascinating to watch here is that you have seen this administration, the Trump administration, sort of looking at the history books. And there are parallels, for example, with Panama in 1989 with Manuel Noriega. In that occasion, he was also seized, brought to the United States, faced similar charges and was found guilty. So there is a precedent of sort of some of the legal questions that may come up. The other thing, of course, is what happened in Iraq and sort of how to lead a country following that. I think we're sort of seeing that playbook again, lessons learned from that.
The ghosts of Iraq are very present. Now, we do have some news from U.S. media reporting that Judge Hellerstein, who is presiding over this case, has now entered the courtroom. The proceeding is underway. Maduro's appeared wearing a short-sleeve navy shirt over a orange jail garb with earphones. So based on that reporting, we do know this is underway on schedule as planned. As we've said before, this arraignment hearing is typically a fairly procedural matter. They usually last somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. It's a chance for defendants to show up in court, to hear their rights read out, to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, and to have the judge perhaps consider pretrial detention options such as bail. That highly unlikely to be the case in a case with this sort of international standing. But we want to bring you the latest from here at this federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan. And for now, I'll hand it back to Christian in the studio for the latest lines there.
Claire, we'll come back to you very shortly. Thank you very much for that. Let's bring in Will Grant, our Latin America correspondent, who's on the border with Colombia, watching these scenes from New York, no doubt. I've been watching, as we were listening to Claire, Will, the traffic going back and forth across the border. What we're not seeing is journalists like you going in, or indeed political dissidents returning to Venezuela. And indeed, many people in Caracas will be looking at a National Assembly that looks very similar to the last one. So what has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is happening, while we're on the one hand seeing Nicolás Maduro appearing in court in New York, we're also seeing Delcy Rodriguez, the acting president in Venezuela, about to be sworn in front of a packed National Assembly. So there's already been, and I've been watching it, the ceremony so far, a huge sense by the Venezuelan government, the apparatus of the state, to give the impression of business as usual. Of course, it's business, but as anything but usual. It's extremely unusual. They've had their head of state taken from Venezuelan soil and whisked to the US. Now, of course, all of the discussion, all of the speeches have been about that so far, and yet they're underpinned with this tone of, but the constitutional order is still in place. We're still in this building. We're still in power. And I think that is the message that they want to translate to the Venezuelan people who are watching this. It's in what they call cadena, which is nationwide coverage on television and radio. And the broadcast is everywhere. So people will be watching that while also keeping an eye on what's going on in New York. But the other thing, of course, is they'll be watching very carefully when Delcy Rodriguez does take the stage, whether or not she continues this tone of sort of reconciliation, this more conciliatory tone to Washington that she started to make last night when she had her first cabinet meeting. She said that an agenda of cooperation should be shared between the United States and Caracas, and that they should focus on their shared development under the margins of international law. A huge departure from the noises she was making after Nicolás Maduro was removed from power, saying, of course, that he was still the constitutional president of Venezuela, that they demand his return, and so on. So that change has been fascinating for Venezuela watchers and, of course, for Venezuelans. For them, it's not so much fascinating as concerning. They're watching this unfold and not knowing what direction the Bolivarian revolution is going to go on, because there will be a lot of competing tensions. Delcy Rodriguez is the current figurehead, but a lot of different competing factions, if you like, behind the scenes.
Just to explain to our viewers, the pictures we're just looking at from Caracas, that box there on the left are the live pictures from the National Assembly, which is beginning a new session. All these members have to be sworn in every year. And indeed, her brother, Delcy Rodriguez's brother, Jorge, has just been reaffirmed as the president of the National Assembly. Just in terms of the pictures that are coming from New York, separate to this, Will, how much might they change the picture? I mean, we're not seeing the sort of protests that we saw back in 2016 and 17, tens of thousands of people on the streets out there in support of the opposition. Why is that not happening, given that he is out of the picture?
The very short version is the crackdown that took place around those protests, and not just those protests around the election last year that President Maduro claimed to have won, which wasn't considered free or fair by the international community, and which the opposition are widely considered to have won by around 2-1 in terms of the vote difference. When people turned out, when they hit the streets, they were rounded up in their dozens, and we saw teenagers, among others, being taken from their homes, arrested by the government security forces for merely posting about it online, for social media posts. So that has had the effect, the desired effect, by the Maduro government, by the regime in Venezuela, of pushing people into very, very squeezed political spaces, ultimately too frightened, and rightly so, to take to the streets at a moment like this amid such uncertainty. A friend of mine in Venezuela was saying, look, of course there are people who are overjoyed that this man is gone, that he's no longer in power, but nobody is dancing in the streets at this, as we saw the scenes taking place in Miami and elsewhere in the United States, in Madrid, in Mexico City, among diaspora Venezuelan communities. You're not going to be doing that in Caracas with still, as it were, the apparatus of the state still in place.
Good to talk to you. Thank you very much for that. Some breaking news from the courthouse in Manhattan. Nicolás Maduro is now in court, has just pleaded not guilty to the charges that have been put against him. Let's go back to Claire Richardson, who's in Manhattan. Claire.
Christian, that's very much the timeline we would have expected. This arraignment hearing having started about 17 minutes ago, and these typically being fairly short affairs. Rights will be read, charges will be read, and then, as you say, the plea entered in this case, not guilty for Nicolás Maduro. And we do know the BBC's partner station, CBS News, reporting that Maduro entered that courtroom wearing a prison garb, headphones for translations to be made, also with his feet shackled. His wife, Celia, had the same clothes on, both their hands unshackled. So just to give you a sense of those scenes unfolding in this lower Manhattan courtroom where this arraignment hearing is taking place. I do also want to bring in our correspondent, Michelle Fleury, who's been covering this story for us. Michelle, good to see you. Tell us a little bit about the judge who's presiding over this case, Judge Alvin Hellerstein. Quite an interesting character.
Yeah, I mean, he has been... he's, as you point out, 92 years old. He's been sort of working on the bench here for several decades now. He has plenty of experience of sensitive cases. If you think back to sort of some of those that have taken place in this building, handling compensation for victims related to 9/11. He was also the judge presiding over the case of the film producer Harvey Weinstein. So he's used to high-profile cases. Another thing particularly relevant here is that over the summer he was the judge who heard the guilty plea from a senior Venezuelan intelligence official who pled guilty. So the reason that's sort of significant is, one, he has experience of kind of dealing with some of these types of charges. I think there are sort of similar drug charges involved, but also whether or not that particular defendant in that case, will he cooperate with the US Justice Department and help them build their case against Nicolás Maduro. So this is a judge who's kind of familiar with some of the questions around this, and there will be lots. But obviously we've never seen anything quite like this, at least not for many decades, involving obviously the leader of a head of state appearing in federal court facing criminal charges. And I think that speaks to sort of some of the kind of febrile atmosphere we're seeing outside the courthouse right now.
That's for sure. We will be seeing intense legal arguments from top legal talent as this trial goes on. Michelle Fleury for us, thank you so much for that update. So as we said, we're just here outside that federal court building where the arraignment hearing is underway for Celia Flores, the wife of Nicolás Maduro, and the Venezuelan leader himself. About 100 meters outside the court, we've got protests taking place coming from both sides. People who support this military action. I've seen members of the Venezuelan diaspora, members who want to see the toppling of the Chinese Communist Party who've come out in favor of this. And then also anti-war protesters who've come out to say no blood for oil. They're against the military intervention. And not far from here, of course, also that UN Security Council emergency meeting taking place at the request of Colombia. So there are legal angles, political angles. It's all happening here in New York City. Christian, let's go back to you in London, though.
Claire, thank you very much. Celia Flores has just been told to stand and confirm her identity. I'm the First Lady, she said, of the Republic of Venezuela. She waived the right to have the indictment read to her. She was asked how she pleaded, and she said, I plead not guilty, completely innocent. Let's bring in Ankush Kadora. He is an attorney and former federal prosecutor who writes for Politico magazine. Thank you for your patience while we got round all our various contributors. So things fairly standard so far. The two things that have to be decided: where is he detained and who represents him? We know that Barry Pollock, who represented Julian Assange, will be one of his attorneys. The question is, how will that be paid for, and where will he be held in the interim?
Well, you know, there are multiple facilities in Manhattan and Brooklyn where he can be held. Other facilities at the Bureau of Prisons decides he needs a more secure environment. How it will be paid for, that's actually a very tricky and important question, particularly in cases where you have people who have acquired a lot of sums through what is alleged to be criminal conduct. That can be a tricky situation, which will require defense lawyers to get involved and potentially even the judge to sort of oversee some of that. I think it's too early to sort of anticipate how that will shake out, but you're right. That sort of thing can be an issue in these sorts of cases. But, you know, I know Barry a little bit. When I was a prosecutor, he was a defense counsel in one of my cases, and he's a very, very capable lawyer. So I'm sure, you know, he and whoever will put up a robust and effective defense under the circumstances to the best they can.
Yeah, the argument he will probably put forward, I imagine, is that Maduro is the sitting president of a sovereign state, that the US courts have no legal authority over him, and therefore the charges are null and void. How will the prosecution for the state respond to that?
Well, look, I think, you know, as your correspondent noted, we have some precedent for this in the form of, you know, the Noriega prosecution. It also seems to be the case that the Trump administration will argue that he's actually not the legitimate head of state. I don't know how that argument will play in this court because it seems to be quite novel, but you know, it seems to be that the administration views him as not democratically elected and not the true leader. So that's another element of this that will probably have to get sorted out. But yeah, these are tricky issues, and this is going to take some time.
Yeah. I mean, corroboration will be key when it comes to the case itself. No doubt Mr. Pollack will make the point that the witnesses in this case are political dissidents, people who are making appeals to the United States, who are getting off charges for drug trafficking, those kinds of people. But what sort of evidence would you expect the US government to have in terms of documentary evidence that would corroborate that testimony from those people?
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. That is a very common defense. You say, look, these people have something to gain by cooperating with the government and shading their testimony to help the government against my client. What can be used to sort of corroborate that? I mean, drug conspiracies usually aren't the sort of conspiracies that where you have a lot of traffic over emails that you can use, but you can use financial transactions, potentially, and potentially some forms of correspondence. I don't mean to be so flip, but this is not like, you know, the sort of financial fraud cases that I often am dealing with. A run-of-the-mill drug conspiracy, even though this is a very large one, but structurally the prosecution is alleging something fairly straightforward as a legal matter. This was a drug prosecution and a drug conspiracy that Maduro was involved in. You would expect a lot of the evidence to come from testimony, maybe pictures, things like that, maybe video to the extent that they have any, but financial transactions as well, I think, would be extremely important here to demonstrate that he was actually actively participating and profiting from this alleged enterprise.
Yeah, just a very quick last one. Presumably, Maduro's security is of paramount importance to the US government.
Presumably, yes. It should be, and I'm sure it is, of course.
But does that mean in terms of his detention, he will be in solitary confinement, he will be in a special penitentiary in order to protect his security?
Probably he will be in a facility where he does not have much interaction with other inmates, very limited interaction with other inmates. The reason why I hesitated a bit is because, of course, we have been talking a lot about Jeffrey Epstein, who did die in U.S. custody, not from another inmate, but, you know, our Bureau of Prisons is not perfect. So this is something that the Justice Department is going to have to be very, very careful and attentive to make sure that, you know, their defendant stays healthy and safe.
Yeah, Epstein was also in my mind, which is why I asked the question. Thank you very much indeed. It's good to talk to you again on the programme. Now, let's go back to Claire, who's outside the courthouse in Manhattan.
Christian, hi. So we've now had not guilty pleas from both President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. Not surprising, that is what we would have expected to happen. But as each not guilty plea was reported, we heard crowds of protesters cheering this plea that they had entered. As we've said, there are crowds gathered around this federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan, both those condemning military action to seize Maduro and his wife, to take them to the United States to face these charges, and also those who are very much in favor, members of the Venezuelan diaspora. I've seen pro-Trump supporters coming out waving flags, saying they're very much in support of the administration's actions here. Now, of course, Maduro accused of 4 counts on the indictment, narco-terrorism, possession of machine guns and destructive devices among them. As we've just said, he's pleaded not guilty. But let's talk a little bit more about what's at play legally here. It's going to be a blockbuster case in probably the years ahead, to be honest. Let's bring in Michelle Fleury, our correspondent, to break it down for us. Michelle, this is just the arraignment. As we've said, it's typically a short proceeding, only 15 to 30 minutes. It's been I guess, about 30 minutes at this stage now, but this is going to present very difficult legal questions in the weeks ahead, isn't it?
And I think, people had questions as to how Nicolás Maduro would appear in court. And clearly, he is coming in defiant, pleading not guilty, suggesting that, he was taken by force. And clearly that is one of the questions, I think, legally going forward. Is he going to try and make an immunity claim? He is, after all, a head of state, a foreign head of state who was taken in the middle of the night by 150 planes to the United States. And so that is one of the questions. What we're already hearing in terms of from the US side is they are making the case that this was actually more of a kind of law enforcement case, that they were simply carrying out a warrant, but obviously plenty of questions about whether or not you can do that on foreign soil. And I think that is an argument that we will hear more and more about. But as you point out, you're right, this is not anything that's going to happen very quickly. Many legal experts are saying the trial might not even begin for another year. And so then the next question becomes, what happens to Nicolás Maduro during that time? Where is he going to be detained? At the moment, obviously, on Saturday, he arrived at that detention facility in Brooklyn, which has seen many sort of well-known figures housed there before. Is he going to stay there? That will be something, again, another challenge for his legal team.
I mean, there is tremendous media interest in this case, not just because of the international ramifications, but also, I think, a little bit by design. What do you make of the way that the Trump administration has really put the image of Nicolás Maduro to the forefront since he was seized alongside his wife in Venezuela? I
mean, this is a foreign head of state. I just should point out the crowds are getting louder right now. Ever since Maduro and his wife entered their not guilty pleas, we've heard sort of the volume increase around the protesters here. But what has been fascinating is you're talking about a foreign head of state essentially being made to do a perp walk.
That's what the Trump administration called it when they posted a video of him walking into the DEA offices.
Yeah,
right?
And it's a striking image, and I suspect that will be something maybe his legal team, potentially, you could think that they might look into that and say, look, you're kind of creating prejudice against my client here. It's worth pointing out that we didn't know this morning who would represent Nicolás Maduro. Now we know it's Barry Pollock. He is someone who has sort of considerable experience handling sensitive cases. He represented Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, so he will certainly be kind of familiar with not just domestic law here in America, but also the kind of international legal questions that are raised by this case.
That's right. He was able to broker that deal for Julian Assange, as you say. He's going to be well placed to navigate some of these tricky legal issues. Michelle Fleury, thank you so much for bringing us the latest just there. So if you're just joining us, this is our live coverage from this federal court in New York City where Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, have been attending their arraignment hearing. I'll send it back to you in the studio, Christian.
Claire, thank you very much. Defiance from Nicolás Maduro, as you would expect. Interesting, I'm watching, as Claire was talking, these pictures from Caracas where the members of the National Assembly are being sworn in front of a picture of Nicolás Maduro. So when he says, I am still the president of my country, as he told the court in Manhattan just a few minutes ago, to all intents and purposes, he is. Vanessa Bush-Luter, Latin America and Caribbean editor for the BBC News website, is with me, along with John Sudworth, a correspondent here as well. Vanessa, that point, they are all taking their pledge in the National Assembly with him in the background. So not there in body, but certainly there in spirit.
Absolutely, and I think this harks back to what Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president at the time, now the acting president, said in the immediate aftermath of those US strikes. She said that Maduro was the only president of Venezuela. And also interesting, the basis on which she has been declared the acting president is the Constitution. And she actually, during that press conference, was holding up the Venezuelan Constitution, this little booklet, or one very similar like this one. And she made the point that his absence was only temporary. So there are two articles in the Venezuelan constitution which deal with the absence of a head of state. One is a temporary absence, in which case the vice president takes over for 90 days. Then the National Assembly has the chance to prolong that for another 90 days. But the National Assembly will have to make the decision at some point whether that absence is absolute. Is the word in the Constitution. So, for example...
So coming back to that point that I made to Will Grant earlier, why are we not seeing people on the streets? Why is there no confidence in the process? In 180 days' time, according to your little book there would presumably have to be an election of some kind. But the Americans would surely know that unless they remove the hardliners around her, the status quo will remain.
Exactly. So for at least 180 days, it looks like Delcy Rodriguez has got the chance to keep her inner circle and herself in power. And, I mean, you saw there at the National Assembly, Nicolás Maduro's son was endorsing her. And everybody who was there was very much the old guard. And in 180 days, there will then have to be a decision taken whether elections are called under the Constitution. But 180 days is a long time. And so people, ordinary Venezuelans who are sitting at home, will not want to risk getting arrested and being thrown in one of the jails that we know also double up as torture centres in some cases, when you're looking at 6 months of that. Well,
90 days would take us somewhere to the end of March. The judge in New York has just ordered Nicolás Maduro to appear in court on March the 17th. Herein is the corrupt conundrum for the US administration, John. They have bitter experience of Libya, Iraq, Syria to an extent, of removing a president and then not knowing how to fill the void. And so they've obviously left Delcy Rodriguez in place for a reason while they get the oil and the economy going again. But it doesn't speak much to the democracy and a new way of working that Donald Trump set out on Saturday.
It doesn't at all, does it?
Although he doesn't specifically talk about democracy.
He hasn't. And if it's there as a priority, it appears at this stage to be quite low down the list. You know, you have to assume that for Delcy Rodriguez, this is now a very difficult dance. She's being offered the chance to keep the regime ultimately intact, it would appear. She has to be able to do that while keeping hardliners on board and yet at the same time appearing to negotiate enough with the Trump administration to give them what they want without looking like she's capitulating. But if she's able to do all that, it appears at this stage anyway, and it's a very early stage, that talk of democracy is going to be kicked way down the line. The opposition have been told essentially that, you know, they're not going to get a look in.
We don't even know where Machado is, do we?
President Trump has said he has very little faith in her. So that really leads you to the question of what is this all about? And it goes back to that point that you know, and I suppose the Trump administration can claim that this is different from Iraq for those reasons. Iraq went wrong, we know, in part because it was a sort of de-Baathification. They took the Ba'ath Party completely out of the picture and the country fell apart. This is an opportunity for Venezuela to essentially continue as normal, just without Maduro, and in which case you would imagine stability is somewhat more assured, but where is democracy in all of that?
The difference with Iraq, as you and I both know because we reported there, is that the Baathists were the minority, actually, and it was the Shia majority that wanted power and assumed power once that Saddam had been taken out of the picture. As you've been saying to me this afternoon, Vanessa, that's not the case in Venezuela. He is at the seat, he's sitting at the top of that power structure, but the power structure commands the National Assembly. Everyone in it is a Chavista.
And not just the National Assembly. I think we would be well advised to remember that the Supreme Court is also dominated by Maduro loyalists. The Electoral Council, that's why a lot of Venezuelans do not want fresh elections, because so many of the institutions are dominated by Maduro loyalists. And there were even questions raised about the voting machines and the company that was hired to run those. Some years ago, there was a referendum which the company Smartmatic itself said had been rigged. That they, of course, said that the machines were functioning properly, but when it came to counting the result, the director of Smartmatic told journalists the National Guard just cleared the room and then came up with a result that they had seemingly written on a piece of paper.
Which is going to beg serious questions in about an hour's time. I think the Secretary of War, the CIA Director, the head of the Joint Chiefs, the Attorney General, They're all going to appear, and the Secretary of State, of course, they're all going to appear in front of Congress, in front of the senior figures in Congress. They're going to be asked, OK, so what next? And if all of this remains in place, as we've just set out, who's really running it?
Well, I mean, that sort of goes to that statement. I mean, President Trump said America is running it. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, suggested that if they are, that's a kind of arm's length pressure on Rodriguez. So at this stage, we don't know. I mean, we haven't really yet had any sense of the detail on what the long-term future is, other than this was about removing Maduro because of this allegation that he was running a narco-terror operation and securing US oil interests. It feels to me that if America can do all that whilst keeping an authoritarian regime in charge in Venezuela, then that may be the outcome that we're looking at here, and that this really wasn't an exercise in building democracy.
Yeah. Well, Nicolás Maduro has been introduced to Barry Pollock, his attorney, for the first time. They shook hands in court, according to the court transcripts that we're getting. Let's go back to Claire, who's outside the courthouse in Manhattan. But clearly he was brought in to look like a prisoner, in prison garb, shackled. There were no luxuries afforded the Venezuelan president as he sees himself.
Yeah, absolutely astonishing to imagine. No cameras allowed inside this courtroom, but of course we are reporting from there. I have our correspondent Michelle Fleury here with me in New York City, just out in front of that federal courthouse where Maduro and Celia Flores are having this arraignment hearing. Michelle, just give us a sense of what's been going on inside in the last half hour.
Yeah, so the hearing, we understand, is now over, and the judge has said that the next date will be March 17. That's when all the parties will reconvene. So about 2 months from now. Of course, there were lots of questions going into this about how Nicolás Maduro and his wife would plead in response to the 4 charges against them. Now we know the answer to that. They have both pleaded not guilty. In fact, we sort of heard some cheers from the protesters outside the courthouse as that news kind of trickled outside here. The other thing is that we understand that health issues have been raised inside, including questions of injuries. Now, the reason that may be something we hear more about is that obviously any trial is a long way off still. And so these are individuals who are going to be held currently at the moment in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. This is sort of not a facility that's kind of well known for handling issues like that. So this might be an attempt on the part of kind of lawyers for the Maduros to try and push for them to be moved maybe to somewhere that is seen as perhaps a little bit nicer, maybe a little bit less kind of harsh than the conditions that reportedly exist currently in that Brooklyn detention center.
That's right. The conditions there are fairly notorious in that Brooklyn detention center, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a place that obviously the rapper P. Diddy spent a lot of time in, Sam Bankman-Fried, the crypto, as well as Ghislaine Maxwell. So it's used to handling high-profile figures, but it doesn't have a great reputation when it comes to kind of health issues. And so I think that will be something that maybe we're beginning to see lawyers for the Maduros kind of try and raise here. The other one, obviously, that we've been talking about all morning is this question about immunity. I mean, we're talking about a foreign head of state appearing in a federal American courthouse facing criminal charges. I think we will hear more going forward about this idea of sort of how he was brought, how he came to be in US custody. I think that will be sort of an issue that they will try and push hard on going forward. But as we said, lawyers for both sides now have about 2 months to sort of go away to try and sort of see discovery and come back and sort of formulate more arguments, legal arguments.
Michelle, thank you so much. So, Christian, as you heard there, that hearing now concluded. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, both pleading not guilty when that news was received here in New York City. Competing protest camps are surrounding us, and one of them went up in cheers when they entered those pleas of not guilty. Maduro telling the court, quote, "I am still president," as he entered that plea, and also said that he was kidnapped to be taken to the United States. Christian, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, next appearance March 17th. We'll continue to watch the Those pictures from New York, no doubt they'll begin to moving from the courthouse back to the penitentiary in Brooklyn. Just struck by the incongruous nature of the pictures there in Manhattan and the pictures in Caracas. We're watching the assembly members one by one being sworn in front of Celia Flores and Nicolás Maduro. The picture there in the background. So to all intents and purposes, in their eyes, he remains the president of Venezuela. Let's go to the border between Venezuela and Colombia. Sumi Somaskanda is there. And of course, what they will be seeing on state television, Sumi, is not the pictures from Manhattan. It's the pictures of the new National Assembly in Caracas.
That's absolutely right, Christian. And it is an image, as you've been talking about all day, an image of unity. We saw a standing ovation for Nicolás Maduro. We've heard a number of deputies speak, and in fact, one message that we heard a short while ago, I just want to read to you, was that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, intends to act as the world's prosecutor, judge, and jury. And from Venezuela, we tell him, you will not succeed. And I think, Christian, it's also interesting to note that Nicolás Maduro's son, Nicolás as well, spoke a little bit earlier, and the same language that his father used today in court to plead not guilty, saying he was kidnapped, is still the president of Venezuela. We heard something similar from his son, and he went on to say, international law exists to curb empires, and without international law, the world returns to the law of the jungle. If we normalize the kidnapping of a head of a state, no country is safe. He's essentially saying today it's Venezuela, tomorrow it could be, here where we are, Colombia. That's a message we've heard from the Colombian president as well, Gustavo Petro, who's remained incredibly defiant in the face of pressure from Donald Trump, the president, who has said that this country's president, President Petro, is a sick man, one who is selling cocaine to the United States. That is a charge that Gustavo Petro completely rejects, and we know that he has said that he stands behind his country and will protect his country, and that he is the rightful president of this country. Of course, there is a difference. Gustavo Petro is democratically elected president, but perhaps as a precaution, what we've seen here is a stepping up of the enforcement along the Venezuela-Colombia border in anticipation of any possible further instability in Venezuela. Unknown, of course, of whether there's going to be any further U.S. intervention in Venezuela. We're also seeing humanitarian aid being stepped up in anticipation of the possibility of more Venezuelans crossing into Colombia. So far, we haven't seen that. Where we are here at the border, everything is running more or less as normal. You'll see behind me cars moving back and forth. People have been moving back and forth all day, and the people we've spoken to say that the situation still remains relatively calm. We are expecting to speak to some Venezuelans who are here in Cucuta a little bit later in the day. But for now, that tension is noticeable, I will say, Christian. It is something that people are talking about. Anytime you turn the radio on or the television on, the news here, what is happening in Venezuela and what President Trump has done with Nicolás Maduro in New York is certainly a big topic here and one people are worried about.
Can I ask you, with your Washington hat on, Sumi, which is where you normally report from, what you make of the relationship now between the administration and the US Congress? By law, Congress should have been briefed on this operation within 48 hours. That's not happened, although we understand there will be a briefing of sorts tonight. How is the US Congress going to respond to this, do you think, over the next week? Because they have been completely sidelined by this. In fact, there are some reports that the oil companies got more of a heads up on this than the Gang of Eight, who should have been told.
Indeed, we heard that as well. Didn't President Trump say that he gave the oil companies a heads up before and after the operation to arrest Nicolás Maduro? Look, when it comes to Congress, it has been really partisan, we should say. I spoke to several members of Congress over the last few months, Republican members of Congress, who told me so far the striking of boats, for example, that the Trump administration accused of trafficking drugs from Venezuela into the U.S., that didn't necessarily need war powers authorization from Congress. They also said that the blockade of oil coming in and out of Venezuela didn't need the authorization of Congress. And when I asked a member of Congress, a Republican, okay, what about the possibility of regime change? He said, well, we're not there yet, and that would need the authorization of Congress. Well, here we are, Christian, and I'm really curious to hear what some of those members of Congress are going to say. We get a sense of what that narrative will be from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He has said that this was a law enforcement operation. that this was an operation to arrest Nicolás Maduro, who had a standing warrant for his arrest and was a direct threat to the United States. Now, whether that is an argument that we'll hear from many members of Congress, I think is pretty likely from Republicans. Democrats, on the other hand, have been somewhat muted in their criticism. They know that Nicolás Maduro is considered a dictator, someone who has brought his country to ruin. They know there's a big Venezuelan-American population diaspora in the United States, many of whom are celebrating him being deposed and sent to the U.S. To face court there. But what is Congress's role in this going to be? Let's see what that briefing brings. As you mentioned, 5:30 Eastern time today, we'll see members of Congress briefed by the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, and others. But you're right, they've been sidelined. And to be honest, Christian, it's not much different from what we've seen all of this year. President Trump really governing from the Oval Office and not including Congress only when he absolutely needs it.
Sumi, as ever, thank you very much for that analysis. Let's bring in Neil Shearing. He's the Group Chief Economist at Capital Economics, because we should talk further about oil and the oil price today and how the oil industry has responded to what happened over the weekend. Bring us up to speed, Neil. How did the oil price fluctuate through the day?
Well, we've not had much of a response, actually, in markets generally and in the oil market. And I think that belies the fact that Venezuela, although it's sitting on the world's largest proven reserves of oil, actually the oil industry has been in serious decline, substantial decline over the past 10 years. So even if we get a bit of a reversal on output over the coming years, as we get a bit better management, a bit more investment in, I think Venezuela is still going to continue to punch below its weight, if you like, within the global oil industry.
Part of the reason for that is because there's such a glut of oil on the world market. Does the world market need the heavy crude oil that Venezuela specialises in?
Well, there's two questions there, isn't there? One is, does it need more? Do we need more oil, or do we have an excess of oil anyway? Because we're seeing a big expansion of production amongst the other OPEC members. And then there's a particular grade of oil that Venezuela produces, as you say, a heavy grade of oil that typically requires it to be mixed with distillates before it's then shipped off and used in other processes. So it's quite expensive to process. So not necessarily difficult to extract, but quite expensive to then process. So all of these challenges go into the mix and have to be factored in when we think about the future prospects for Venezuela's oil industry. Clearly massive potential, but huge barriers to overcome in order to realise that potential.
How would shareholders of ExxonMobil, Chevron, who've had a history in Venezuela, view the pressure that the companies are being put under now to reinvest in those oil wells, which, as we know, are in quite a state of disrepair?
Quite a state of disrepair. If the market's anything to go by today, the equity market, having said there's not much movement in the markets generally in the oil market, Chevron shares at one point up 10%. So clearly a sense amongst some investors that Chevron's well positioned to benefit, to capitalise, if you like, on some of the potential of exploiting oil in Venezuela under this new regime, as yet extremely uncertain, of course. Clearly, though, that is going to involve vast sums of capital expenditure investment in order to both repair wells, but also to develop new wells too going forward. So it's going to take some time for that new production to come on stream. So if there is to be increase in production in future, it's going to require enormous capital expenditure up front. That's going to pay back over many years. And clearly, if you're a shareholder in that business, you're going to want some kind of sense of security that the institutional architecture, the rules of the game, if you like, are going to remain relatively stable. So some degree of trepidation, I would imagine.
Neil Shearing, thank you for that. Really interesting. John Sudworth is with me in the studio. There has been some reaction within the Security Council, which we've shown our viewers this afternoon, from China. It's an area you know very well. Some suggestion this afternoon that the minerals deal they did with the United States quite recently, the rare earths that America needs for its companies like Nvidia, that if its oil imports are messed with, then they might return to the hard line they took some months ago. That would upset the world markets.
Yeah, and this goes to that concern about the law of unintended consequences, Christian. even if Venezuela remains relatively stable, if, as it looks at least for now, the regime stays pretty much intact. Clearly, American pressure is being brought to bear. That's what Donald Trump says this is all about. And up until now, in exchange for very large loans, China has been a beneficiary of Venezuelan oil. If that's now under threat, the suggestion is, from some of the reporting, that China could in turn retaliate, perhaps again over rare earths and access to those precious minerals, leading to sort of more conflict across the Pacific Ocean between the US and China. All speculation at this stage, but you have to imagine, given what's happened, China won't like it. And it will be certainly thinking about what sorts of actions it could take if it does feel that its interests are threatened.
These are live pictures from Manhattan. The armoured truck that is leaving currently would suggest that Nicolás Maduro and Celia Flores are being taken back to Brooklyn. This is really the reverse picture of what we saw earlier in the day. They're taken to a heliport and then flown back to Brooklyn. We'll continue to watch those pictures. Some of the statements from China, a country, again, that you know very well, were quite extraordinary in mind of their approach to Taiwan. They're talking about the right to self-determination, an end to bullying. There are lots of people who've watched what happened over the weekend who say, well, this is going to set an awful precedent. It's going to give Russia free rein in Ukraine, and it's going to give China an incentive to invade Taiwan. What do you make of that?
Yeah, as you say, Chris, I was in China for 9 years, and at every US election, we'd be asked the question: who does China want to win, Trump or Biden, Trump or Kamala Harris? And I think often from the outside, the assumption was that they would have more to fear from those who spoke the language of human rights, who felt that there was something of a difference in democratic values that needed to be at the heart of the global order. That would be more threatening to China than Donald Trump. And so, in the end, I think the idea was that they really wouldn't want Joe Biden or Kamala Harris to win. In the end, what I think you had to conclude, particularly when you look at some of China's actions, is in the end that Donald Trump, although he hasn't subscribed to those sorts of democratic values, although he does appear intent on upsetting the rules-based global order, in the end, China, although it may have much to fear from an America First policy and a president who is prepared to enforce America's will by military means in a way that perhaps none other have, there's also something of an opportunity. How much harder is it going to be for America's NATO allies in Europe to stand up and speak openly about their opposition to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, in the light of what's just happened this weekend in Venezuela? How much easier is it going to be for China to make the case that it has the right to its own Monroe Doctrine in its own backyard and ought to be allowed to take Taiwan?
And you were making the point earlier, for our viewers who missed it, that there was some suggestion that in the early conversations between Putin and Trump, there was a sort of, well, you take Ukraine and we'll take Venezuela conversation that might have actually come to pass.
Yeah, and if you look at the way President Trump has been speaking about Ukraine, obviously, he's shifted position, but ultimately it has always come back to this idea that in that relationship, if you call it that, or in that war in Ukraine, Russia is the one with power and might and military force on its side, and Ukraine just needs to recognise that reality. You remember that infamous meeting in the Oval Office just weeks after Donald Trump took office for his second term, where he was saying to President Zelensky, you don't have any cards. It wasn't about principle. It wasn't about fighting for democratic values. And so I think in what's just happened, in those questions about international law, but I think even more so in the question of what comes next, if this turns out not to be an exercise at all in attempting to move Venezuela to a more democratic, freer future, then I think Europe, the rest of the world, will see in that very troubling signs about what we ought to conclude about US values and this White House's commitment to something that everybody has taken for granted, that for right or wrong, up until this presidency, America has pretty much stood on the side of democracy, even intervened on behalf of it, however imperfectly. Those days, it may well be now, this moment, that tell us they are well and truly gone.
These are live pictures from Manhattan as the armoured truck goes into a tunnel of Nicolás Maduro being returned with his wife to custody in Brooklyn. He will be held there until his next appearance in court on March the 17th. For those just joining, he and his wife have put a defiant position across today in court, both of them pleading not guilty. The president saying, "I remain the president of my country." His wife saying that she is the First Lady of Venezuela, and the members of the new National Assembly in Caracas being sworn in today in front of a portrait of Nicolás Maduro and his wife. So much happening around the issue of Venezuela. We're going to continue to watch this, but for the moment, let's go to Claire, who is still outside the courthouse in Manhattan. Claire.
Christian, quite a scene here. I don't know if you can hear the choppers that are overhead. We are surrounded by the world's media here, all eyes on this arraignment hearing. There have also been protesters gathering about 100 meters outside the courthouse, both those who were in favor of the Trump administration's intervention into Venezuela to seize Maduro and his wife in the dead of the night, to take them to the United States and eventually to this courtroom, which I'm standing in front of right now for this arraignment hearing, and also protesters who are very much against it, who say that this is blood for oil, waving big banners to that effect. Now, we know Venezuela's Maduro told the U.S. court, "I am still president," that as he entered a not guilty plea deal. And as that news broke out here, cheers went up among one segment of those protesters. Celia Flores, his wife, also pleading not guilty to charges she's facing. I want to bring in our correspondent, Michelle Fleury, who can just paint a picture of what we've seen so far. Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for being with us still. Just talk us through what's happened today at this arraignment.
Yeah, so the judge has adjourned the proceedings until March 17th. So now both sides have about 2 months to sort of prepare for their next court appearance. But it was a kind of dramatic morning in court. I think people were sort of had many questions about what it would look like seeing a foreign head of state appearing in federal court here in the building behind us in front of Judge Alvin Hellerstein. And as you mentioned, we saw Nicolás Maduro basically say he was pleading not guilty, but also kind of pushing back against the idea both of the manner of his arrest, but also saying he was still very much the leader of Venezuela. You also had his wife. She also pleaded not guilty. And there was conversations, talk about her health. That was something her lawyer brought up as an issue going forward. And so that could have a bearing on this case going forward. Not so much the kind of trial, which we expect probably won't take place yet for another year, but in terms of how they spend their time between now and then. Currently, they're being held in detention in Brooklyn at the Metropolitan Detention Center. It's sort of notorious for not necessarily having the best conditions, certainly when it comes to health issues. And so that was something they were quick to mention, that she was injured during that raid that took place on Saturday in the early hours.
And Michelle, this arraignment hearing, very procedural as they typically are. It only lasted about half an hour. We had Maduro entering the courtroom shortly after it was scheduled to begin at noon Eastern time, wearing prison garb, headphones for translations for him to be able to understand the proceedings, and his feet shackled. This is part of the spectacle that we've seen over the past few days since he was whisked away in the night. Just give us a sense of how that might factor into future legal proceedings.
Well, I mean, I think, this idea of what the U.S. administration called a perp walk featuring Nicolás Maduro, I think that is highly unusual to see a foreign head of state treated that way. And so that may be something that his legal representation, he's got a gentleman called Barry Pollock who has represented Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, in the past. That may be something that he will sort of try to return to. This idea that there is maybe prejudice, that this is not how you treat the leader of a foreign state. There's also the sort of legality of how he was brought to the United States. That may be something we hear more about. But again, these are all questions now that we're going to kind of wait and find out more about. There is discovery, so the legal team for the Maduros will get an opportunity to sort of look at some of the evidence that has been gathered against them by the US Department of Justice. It's also an opportunity for the US Justice Department to kind of build up their case. We've already heard some sort of sense of what they're thinking, because if you look at comments in the past from Attorney General Pam Bondi, she's talked about Maduro partnering with terrorist organizations. She alleges groups like the Sinaloa cartel and others to sort of try and get drugs into the United States. So we have a kind of outline, but we don't yet know the details of the case, and I think that's something that's going to come out more and more as the weeks go by. But obviously an extraordinary scene today.
And of course, it's a big day for New York in general. The UN Security Council also holding this emergency meeting at the request of Colombia to address what it calls threats to international peace and security. And there we heard the U.S. ambassador to the UN really making a case that might give us some hints about the direction that the prosecution will be taking against Maduro and his wife. Firstly, making the narco-terrorism argument that has been consistent since we saw the beginning of those small boat strikes back in September, that this was essentially a law enforcement operation, but while also saying that Maduro is an illegitimate leader, and that very much goes to the legal point you were raising that I think we'll hear Maduro's lawyers bring up in court.
Yeah, I mean, I think the legality, there are a couple of questions here. One is the legality of the raid on Nicolás Maduro and how he and his wife were brought here. Whether or not that somehow then sort of invalidates it. We're already beginning to see, as you say, the US argument is that they are simply enforcing a kind of arrest warrant. And there is precedent for this. If you look at the way, for example, back in, a couple of decades ago, Manuel Noriega of Panama, he was brought to the United States under similar circumstances. The charges were pretty similar, and there was a successful conviction. And interestingly, the point of law that was used then was a 1989 memo that was written by none other than Bill Barr, who you may recall was, the head of the Justice Department under the first Trump administration. That memo, no doubt, will be invoked here by the administration to kind of justify the actions. The other question is the international law one. I mean, obviously, you and I are talking today about US charges being brought in a federal court, but there is a broader question of international law about whether or not you can do this to a foreign head of state. And I think that question still remains. And obviously, there are questions about legitimacy that will continue, I think, to percolate.
They've told us a little bit about Maduro's legal representation, something we found out today, that this was the person who represented Assange was able to get that deal for the WikiLeaks founder. What about the judge, Alvin Hellerstein, who's presiding over this case? He's 92 years old. As you've said, he's now said we won't be seeing him in court, or anybody for that matter, until March. But just give us a sense of what we might expect from him.
I mean, what was fascinating was that at the start of the proceedings here, he made a point of saying this would be a fair trial. I think given the fact that it is such a sensitive case, it is controversial right from the beginning, he went out of his way to kind of make that point and to read Nicolás Maduro his rights in front of him to make sure he heard those. This is someone who has lots of experience. He was appointed to the bar by Bill Clinton. He has served on the bench here for over 2 decades, and he has dealt with some pretty delicate cases. He presided over the case of the compensation victims for 9/11. He also was the judge in the case of the film producer Harvey Weinstein. So he's no stranger to the spotlight and to having to kind of work under pressure. And he is also, interestingly, dealt with a previous Venezuelan official just recently this summer who pled guilty. This was a former senior intelligence official, and we'll have to wait and see whether that individual is cooperating now with the US Justice Department in this particular case against Nicolás Maduro.
Michelle Fleury, thank you so much for bringing us the latest there. We are, of course, covering this historic arraignment hearing for the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, Cilia Flores. That wrapped up just about half an hour ago. It was a roughly half-hour-long hearing, as is typical in a procedural arraignment like this, and that is the very latest for you from here in Lower Manhattan. We'll hand it back over to Anita in the studio.
Claire, thank you very much, and we will be back in New York very shortly. Welcome to the programme, to The World Today on BBC News on a really busy day. Our coverage, of course, dominated by repercussions of those extraordinary events in Venezuela at the weekend. So let's just reset for you and bring you up to date, because in the last few minutes, the former Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, has appeared in court saying, "I'm still the president of my country," as he and his wife, Cilia Flores, pleaded not guilty on a range of charges. Now, this is the scene live in Manhattan right now, where Maduro and his wife and others who have been charged are being brought back into detention, the reverse, if you like, of what we saw a little earlier today when he was transferred from Brooklyn to Manhattan by helicopter to be met by military and law enforcement officials. He was then escorted to an armoured vehicle for transport from the heliport to the federal courthouse. So this journey really happening in reverse. And we saw that, you can call it a perp walk, can't you, where Maduro in a jumpsuit, handcuffed, being escorted by those heavily armed military and law enforcement officials, was brought to that armoured vehicle to be taken to the courthouse. And definitely an image that the US administration will want to be seen around the world. And here you can see that image now. Well, let me just bring you up to date with what has been happening as we look at these pictures. Maduro and his wife now, as we say, having left court, doing the reverse of the journey that they undertook to get to court earlier today. A huge media presence in Manhattan for that court hearing, as well as protesters, some pro, some anti-Maduro. And Nicolás Maduro, as we were saying, arriving in handcuffs earlier, escorted by armed officers to face a 25-page indictment against him, including charges of drug trafficking and money laundering. He denies all of the charges. And they were transferred, Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, in this armoured vehicle from a detention centre in Brooklyn. Really extraordinary moment, especially for Venezuelans. And these pictures we're showing you now are from the emergency session of the UN Security Council, which was taking place in New York. The 15-member council has been summoned to discuss events in Venezuela and the seizure of Nicolás Maduro by the US. Colombia called the emergency session, supported by China and by Russia. OK, well, joining me now from the Venezuela-Colombia border is my colleague Sumi Somaskanda. And in New York, Claire Richardson is there for us also. Good to see you both again. Claire, I'll come to you first of all. Just sum up for us, if you would, as we've been watching these pictures of Nicolás Maduro being taken away from the court to detention. Sum up for us the main details of what happened in court.
I mean, a remarkable day here in Lower Manhattan in front of this courthouse. The world's media present, as you said, and also these protesters, cheers going up as Nicolás Maduro entered that not guilty plea, and then also his wife doing the same. Now, this arraignment hearing was always going to be a short affair. They typically last around 15 to 30 minutes, and indeed this was about 40 minutes long, but it was the first time we saw them appearing in U.S. court after being seized in Venezuela and brought to the United States. Of course, cameras not allowed in the courtroom, but we did have our reporter there to witness what happened. Let's bring in Madeline Halpert for the latest. And Madeline, you can just tell me what you saw from Maduro and his wife.
Yeah, it was quite a dramatic arraignment, having seen a lot of them. When Maduro walked in, he was shackled with his legs as well as his wife, and he turned around to look at the crowd. and he appeared to kind of salute them and nod his head and say buenos dias to some people in the audience. And then the judge asked him to confirm that he was indeed Nicolás Maduro, which usually he would just respond, a defendant would respond yes. He took the time to sort of profess his innocence and say he'd been kidnapped, he was captured at his home, and the judge sort of interrupted him to say there will be a time and place for that. And his wife was pretty soft-spoken. She had bruises on her face that her attorney said she sustained during her capture. The most dramatic moment came at the end of the hearing when a person from the audience interjected to say that Maduro would pay for what he'd done. And Maduro responded that he was a decent man, that he was a prisoner of war before he was taken back in his leg shackles away from the court.
And Maduro very much staying firm, from what I understand, telling the U.S. court, I am still president and that I've been captured. Give us a sense of what it was like with the judge who's presiding over this case. Yeah. He's 92 years old, right?
Yes, he's 92. He's presided over a lot of high-profile cases, so he was very no-nonsense. And he did have to deal with Maduro kind of taking these liberties of going on in his speech, which is not always typical for defendants. So he kind of kept pretty good control of the courtroom until the very end when that person interjected and they were actually taken out crying from the room.
And we also know this is the last we'll be seeing from inside the courtroom for a while, right? The judge said that this would reconvene in March.
Yes, we're not going to hear from them for a little while. They waived their right to a speedy trial.
Okay, so that's the arraignment hearing for today. The last we'll see from them for a while. Madeline, thank you so much for bringing us the latest from inside that courtroom. Again, we're here in Lower Manhattan at this federal court where that arraignment hearing has now finished. As expected, both Maduro and his wife having pleaded not guilty to the U.S. charges against them.
And very briefly, Claire, your interpretation of that very public walk of Nicolás Maduro in shackles, clearly intended for the world to see.
Yes, I think very much the optics of this have been an important part of the Trump administration's approach here. You see the kind of information they've been posting on social media that is essentially mocking the Venezuelan leader and his wife. I think the theatrics, if you want to call it that, of bringing him into the United States. We saw footage of him entering the DEA office before he was taken to that detention facility in Brooklyn. And, you know, the world's attention, not just for the geopolitical implications that this is undoubtedly going to have, but also for the spectacle of it all, is very much on display here in New York. And as we said, it's drawn out protesters who feel strongly on both sides, members of the Venezuelan diaspora who are really happy to see, for now at least, to see Maduro seized and brought to the United States, standing trial. And those who say no blood for oil is one sign that I saw here, who say that this should not be the beginning of further American involvement in Venezuela.
Okay, Claire Richardson there outside the federal courthouse in Manhattan. Thank you very much. And let's cross now to the Venezuela-Colombia border. My colleague Sumi Somaskanda is there. Sumi, good to see you. While all of that has been unfolding in New York, Venezuela is waiting for its new interim president to be sworn in. Tell us about Delcy Rodriguez, and what exactly do we know about the status of the relationship between her and the U.S. administration right now?
That's a really good question, Anita. That's something we're still trying to work out. We've heard differing messages. As you said, the National Assembly has been holding this swearing-in ceremony. We can say that Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, that she will be sworn in as the acting president. And in fact, her brother, Jorge Rodriguez, who is the head of the National Assembly, has been speaking just a moment ago. And I want to read a portion of what he said. He said, "We call for the respect for what is ours, for Venezuelan life and the essence of being Venezuelan." And he went on to say, anything that comes from the outside will always be worse. Bombs do not only fall on the heads of Chavistas. Speaking about Chavistas, supporters of the former Venezuelan leader, Hugo Chavez. Now, it's interesting to see that there is this big show of unity behind Delcy Rodriguez in this National Assembly meeting. We have seen that through the course of the day, a standing ovation for Nicolás Maduro, and really the civilian and military sides of Venezuela that make up Nicolás Maduro's regime, the apparatus that has kept him in power for so long, that they have come together behind Delcy Rodriguez. But we have to be honest, she's in a pretty difficult position. She's been put under immense pressure by President Trump, by his Secretary of State. They've essentially given her an ultimatum, haven't they? They will continue to put pressure, blockade oil, threaten further military action unless she meets their demands, their wishes. Those demands including stopping the flow of migrants into the U.S., stopping the flow of drugs into the U.S. And just to give you a sense, Anita, of where we are, this is actually, as you said, the Colombian-Venezuelan border. This is the border crossing. And as you can see, it is a busy border crossing. And we've seen so many cars going back and forth. And right now, there's actually a pretty long line from the Colombian side to get into Venezuela. And, this is a place that moves people, goods, all sorts of wares that are going back and forth. And this bridge, Puente Simón Bolívar, that we've seen just behind us, if you cross just past there, you get directly into Venezuela. We can't go in at the moment. Journalists are not being allowed in. But what you would see is Venezuelan army. And that just gives you a sense of how closely connected these two countries are as well. And the reason that's important is the flow of migrants really has come across this bridge so often in the past 5 to 10 years. Venezuelans who have been fleeing, Venezuela, fleeing economic insecurity and violence and political persecution. At the moment, things here seem calm, but there is very much the sense that anything could change in any moment, that this tenuous relationship that you mentioned between Delcy Rodriguez and the U.S., that could turn at any moment and really change the situation here at the border and across Colombia and, of course, inside Venezuela.
Yeah, and is there a sense of nervousness inside Colombia right now, Sumi, because we've seen President Trump direct comments towards his Colombian opposite number, Gustavo Petro, of the nature that he was sending to Nicolás Maduro in the last few weeks and months. He spoke to reporters on Air Force One saying a military operation in Colombia, quote, sounds good.
Yeah, and he called the Colombian president a sick man running a sick country who is fueling the cocaine industry and sending cocaine to the United States. Look, there is a sense of calm here at the border, but there is also a sense that this is a real possibility for confrontation. I've received messages from Colombian friends who have said we are really worried because of the rhetoric from President Trump. If you listen to the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, he's remained defiant. He's been very clear that he will not tolerate any sort of aggression from President Trump from the U.S. In fact, in a message that he put out on X earlier today, he said, I haven't picked up arms since the Peace Pact of 1989, but, I will pick up arms to defend our country even if I don't want to. So very strong words from the president. That doesn't change the fact, however, Anita, that there is that nervousness that you mentioned. There is a sense that what happens in Venezuela very well could bleed over into Colombia, and we could see a direct confrontation between President Trump and Colombia's president. Remember that we saw the U.S. actually sanction Colombia's president, his wife, his son, the interior minister, over some of his actions. And that confrontation is only continuing to grow in the war of words, if you will, between these two leaders.
OK, Sumi, thank you very much. Sumi Somaskanda there. And we'll have much more on that story for you, so do stay with us here on The World Today. We'll be back after this short break around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC News. Let's return to our coverage of what's been happening in Venezuela and indeed the first hearing for Nicolás Maduro, the deposed president of Venezuela, in New York in the last hour or so. As we mentioned, members of the UN Security Council have been meeting in an emergency session about events in Venezuela. The US ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, called Nicolás Maduro a narco-trafficker and accused him of committing crimes against the people of the US over the last 15 years.
Colleagues, Nicolás Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years.
OK, let's speak now to Benjamin Gadan, Director of the Latin America Programme at the Foreign Affairs think tank, the Stimson Centre. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme, Benjamin. Lots to talk about. I was reading a quote just a short while ago from President Erdogan of Turkey, thought to have a pretty good relationship with President Trump, who says he's spoken to President Trump in a phone call and warned that Venezuela mustn't be dragged into chaos. He said violating countries' sovereignty and international laws can create global complications. And I know that you've been putting your mind to this, and you think there are a number of options that could flow from America's actions in Venezuela. There could be chaos, there could be an orderly democratic transition, or there could be a cosmetic change at the top. What do you think is most likely?
Yeah, it's interesting right now. The decision by President Trump was audacious and certainly carried many tactical risks. But at this point, the ambitions for Venezuela are rather modest, right? I mean, what we've seen so far is a cosmetic change. The vice president of the Maduro regime is now in charge. And for the foreseeable future, it appears the United States is willing to give her a chance to meet U.S. demands while maintaining the structure of the regime indefinitely.
Is that orderly enough for the oil companies, the US oil companies that President Trump wants to invest heavily in Venezuela to upgrade its oil production?
I don't think so, certainly not at the moment, right? I mean, the chaos of a genuine political transition and a return to democracy would have carried arguably greater short-term risks and disincentivize investment from the oil industry. But for now, you would need to see some sense that this leadership will be in power for the medium term and that it's willing to meet demands to change royalties, tax incentives, and the percentage of ownership that's permitted for foreign firms.
Benjamin, I'm going to apologise and ask if you can bear with us for a moment, because we want to go to the UK Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who's speaking about Venezuela in the House of Commons. Let's listen in.
Venezuelan people. So the international community must come together to help achieve a peaceful transition to a democratic government that respects the rights and will of its people. That must mean action on the economic crisis, the release of political prisoners, the return of opposition politicians, an end to political repression, respect for human rights, and plans for the holding of free and fair elections. And I urge the acting President, Delcy Rodriguez, to take these steps forward, because the people of Venezuela have a right to decide their own future. The US Secretary of State and I discussed the particular role that the UK can play to support a peaceful democratic transition and stability. Because drawing on our embassy in Caracas and on the work that we have done over many years to build up relationships and dialogue with Venezuelan opposition parties and with the current authorities and regime, and of course our relationship with the US. To that end, I have also spoken today with Venezuelan opposition leader Marina Corina Machado, and her unwavering fight for democracy, human rights and the rule of law in Venezuela and against oppression is inspirational, and we will keep in touch over the days and weeks ahead. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me turn briefly to another matter. The House will have seen recent comments from the United States and from Denmark regarding Greenland. Let me be very clear on the UK position. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Our close European partners, our long-standing NATO allies, and all our countries work closely together on security issues and will always do so. The future of Greenland is a matter for the Greenlanders and Danes and no one else. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
The UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper speaking there, mentioning Greenland, which of course is in the sights of the US. We'll be talking about that a little bit later on the programme with an MP from Greenland, but also then primarily focusing in on Venezuela, appealing for democratic elections and urging the interim president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, who's about to be sworn in the next short while, we understand, to put the conditions in place for democratic elections. Also, we heard Yvette Cooper saying she'd spoken to the Nobel Peace Laureate, Marina Corina Machado, about the situation in Venezuela. Well, let's return now to Benjamin Gadan, Director of the Latin America Programme at the Foreign Affairs think tank, the Stimson Centre. Benjamin, thank you very much for your patience interrupting you mid-interview. Let's talk about what this means for order, both order in Venezuela and more widely world order, the actions of the United States over the last few days. Your thoughts on that, if you would.
Yeah, I would say there's divergent impacts from this decision from Donald Trump. In Venezuela, the decision to keep the regime in place, though obviously disadvantageous for democracy in Venezuela and for the democratic opposition, gives a greater chance for stability in the short term. Right? This is a country that is not easy to govern. There's the presence of Colombian guerrillas, militias armed by the state. The military has the possibility of fracturing in a political transition scenario, which would create conditions for an insurgency. So for now, the decision to go with Delcy Rodriguez as the ruler of Venezuela, though she's an authoritarian figure herself, means that the country probably holds itself together for the moment. Globally, the precedent set by this invasion certainly doesn't augur stability, right? This creates a world where might makes right, and big countries, or even medium-sized countries, when they have a military advantage over an adversary, will feel much more free to use military force.
There's a contradiction in all of this, though, isn't there, Benjamin, given that Delcy Rodriguez has been Nicolás Maduro's right-hand woman for many years, is part of or his government, what was his government, and yet, President Trump, at least for the moment, seems content to work with her. And the reasons he's given, the justifications he's given for this action, he talked first of all about drugs, when indeed we know that more drugs come from into the United States from other Latin American countries. And then he moved on to talk about stolen oil. So it's all a little bit contradictory, isn't it? Does that set up problems, do you think?
It's not really contradictory unless you presuppose that the United States remains interested in bringing democracy back to Venezuela and protecting the human rights of Venezuelans. That was U.S. policy for decades under presidents from both political parties. The current U.S. administration has been pretty explicit that it's agnostic when it comes to the types of governments around the world. And so, as you've articulated, its interests in Venezuela are quite different. They are impeding Venezuela's role, though modest, in cocaine trafficking and having greater control over Venezuela's natural resources. It seems like for the time being, Trump is comfortable pursuing those goals with the regime in place, but having removed its previous dictator.
What sort of advantage would that give the United States if it does indeed encourage US oil companies to invest in Venezuelan oil production? What's the direct impact on the US administration and what President Trump can say he has done?
Yeah, I think he wants to declare victory over the cocaine trafficking cartels that allegedly operate in Venezuela and off its shores. And I think he wants to create greater opportunities for U.S. firms, whether that is seizing Venezuelan oil or having these firms invest in Venezuela under advantageous terms. We'll find out. But I think that is what he's pursuing at this point. And very explicitly, for now, he's not pursuing a broader transformation of Venezuela's political system.
OK, Benjamin Gadan from the Stimson Centre. Good to get your thoughts today. Thank you very much. Let's take you back to the House of Commons here in London. The Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch, is speaking.
Commitment. It has never been more important for the UK to have a coherent foreign policy strategy. Right now, Labour doesn't have one. If they do, we'd like to hear the Foreign Secretary tell us what it is, because I didn't hear anything remotely sounding like that in her statement. Let us be honest, Madam Deputy Speaker. Old strategies will not work. We are living in an increasingly dangerous world. The axis of authoritarian states seeking to undermine us respects just one thing: strength. Britain must be ready and willing to defend our own interests, to protect ourselves from those who would undermine us, to protect the unity of the Western alliance, and to support democracy and freedom around the world.
Foreign Secretary.
I must just say to the leader of the opposition, obviously welcome her support on Switzerland, on Greenland, Denmark, and so on. But I have to say that really felt like a very poorly judged tone of response that was really all over the place. Many times when we were in opposition, we had issues that we agreed with the government on, and in the national interest, we set out our agreement, and we recognise that some of these were cross-party issues. I actually suspect that had the Shadow Foreign Secretary have made that response to our statement, she probably would have done that. And, in fact, on the different issues that she talked about on Venezuela, she seemed to agree with us that the Maduro regime has been deeply damaging, corrupt and deeply destructive, and therefore it is that no one should shed any tears for it going. She also, I think, implicit when she talked about the rules-based order, recognised the importance of precedents, of the importance of international law, and also the complexity of the world in which we face. And she also said that she thought we should show support for Denmark and for Greenland. So, in fact, I could not see a single detailed thing that she disagreed with in that response, except for the fact that she seems to want to express opposition for opposition's sake. And I would, let me just say to her, just in terms of the overall approach, and I think everyone recognises the leadership that this Prime Minister has shown on the international stage. Chairing the coalition of the willing, leading the European and international support for Ukraine against Russia, agreeing 3 trade deals with India, Europe, the US, after her government ripped up the trade cooperation and trashed the UK's reputation across the world. The biggest increase in defence investment since the Cold War, properly supporting UK security, and with the US, the most successful state visit leading to major tech investment in the UK, with the UK Prime Minister who talks frequently to the US, and deep partnerships on security, intelligence and the military, and our close working now on Gaza, on the peace process, on the crisis in Sudan, and of course, fundamentally, on Ukraine. So, many times in the past, we took a cross-party approach. I would just expect her to do the same on the matters that are really about the future of this country. This government will continue to stand up for Britain's interests, for our prosperity and for our values.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. If a large and powerful country abducts the leader of another, however abhorrent that leader is, and then tries to intimidate the smaller country in order, it says itself, to gain access to its resources, doesn't the Foreign Secretary agree that this should be called out? Not just by Britain, but by our Western allies. We should be calling it out for what it is, a breach of international law. It is not for the country that is breaking the law to say whether or not it has broken the law. It is for the West, surely, to stand up and say, call it as it is. Doesn't she therefore share my concern that there might be a profound risk of international norms changing? If we don't do that, it may become okay. And that is a risk that we then risk living in a world where might is right. And surely that isn't in Britain's interests.
Secretary.
Can I just thank my honourable friend for her question, and also recognise that she has been consistent in her opposition to the Maduro regime, even when she was under pressure not to be through many years. And I know that she and I would probably agree that a man who is currently being investigated for crimes against humanity and who has such a history of political repression as well as economic destruction and corruption should not be leading a country. And she rightly refers to the issues around international law, and I've set out our commitment to international law, and she will know that my predecessor as Foreign Secretary talked about progressive realism, where we set out the progressive principles we follow, how important international law is because of the framework that it sets that is in our interests, not just reflecting our values, but also that we engage with the world the way it is. And I can assure her that as part of that, I have raised this issue of international law with Secretary of State Rubio and made clear that we will continue to urge all countries to follow it.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Edward Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I associate myself and my party with the comments from the Foreign Secretary about the tragedy in Crans-Montana? Madam Deputy Speaker, when President Reagan invaded Grenada, Margaret Thatcher said this: "We in the Western democracies use our force to defend our way of life. We do not use it to walk into other people's countries. We try to extend our beliefs not by force but by persuasion." So I'm disappointed we've heard nothing as clear and courageous from either the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary or today's Conservative Party. Maduro is a brutal, illegitimate dictator, but that does not give President Trump a free pass for illegal action. This wasn't about liberating the Venezuelan people. Trump's refusal to back Nobel Prize winner Maria Machado, Maduro's brave liberal opponent, shows Trump has no interest in Venezuelan democracy. This is about Trump believing he can grab anything he wants and get away with it, this time oil. We know what happens when an American president launches an illegal war under the pretext of an imminent threat. It's why we oppose the Iraq war and why we condemn Trump today. National sovereignty matters. International law matters. Without them, the world is far more dangerous and we are all less safe. Anyone who thinks Trump's actions will make China or Russia think twice is either hopelessly desperate or desperately naive. Putin and Xi will be using this precedent to strengthen their hands in Ukraine and Taiwan. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, anyone who thinks Trump will stop with Venezuela hasn't read his new national security strategy. He's already threatening Colombia, Cuba and Greenland and even democracies across Europe. Does the Foreign Secretary not realise how ridiculous it looks to refuse to call this what it is, a clear breach of international law? Will she at least publish all the advice the government has received on the legality of Trump's actions?
Secretary.
Well, let me say to the honourable gentleman that we do, I hope, agree on the brutality of the Maduro dictatorship, and also I would hope that Venezuela has it is better for Venezuela not to be led by somebody like Maduro. And therefore, the most important thing now for Venezuela is for it to have a transition to democracy. And I have spoken directly to the US Secretary of State about that, and also about the potential role that the UK can play in that, because unusually we have a very senior and experienced charge d'affaires in Venezuela who has long-standing relationships with the Venezuelan opposition, with the regime, and also, of course, we have a close relationship with the US. That puts us in a particular position and gives us a particular responsibility in order to keep progress being made towards that democratic transition, because stability will not be maintained unless there is a transition that is in the will of the people. We say to him, just in terms of international law, again, we have made very clear our commitment to international law and the way that it must guide our decisions in UK foreign policy, and we will continue to raise it with our partners, both in public and in private, and it is important that we do so. And as for the issue on government legal advice, he will know that the Ministerial Code is very clear about government not either publishing or commenting on different legal advice.
Diane Abbott.
Nobody in this chamber wants to defend
the regime of Maduro. But what some of us want to do is to stand up for the importance of a rules-based international order. And I might add, because my parents were born overseas, I take the question of national sovereignty extremely seriously. And you cannot have a situation where a country, because it is bigger and stronger, walks into a smaller country, snatches its political leadership, whatever you think of that political leadership, but snatches its political leadership, helicopters it out, and puts it on a show trial in an outside country. That cannot be something which this government is prepared to support. And let me add, I know that, the opposition are blithe about what Trump is doing. Blithe. I know the opposition are blithe about what Trump is doing, but let me say this. There will be countries that will look at Trump's attitude and carelessness to issues of sovereignty, and they will think, what happens if they have that threat? Who will be willing to stand up for them? Who will be willing to stand up for their national sovereignty? As far as I have heard thus far, it won't necessarily be our ministers. And there will be individuals.
Order. The Right Honourable Lady must get to a question shortly, please.
The question is, what would the Foreign Secretary say to British voters, ordinary British voters, not particularly left-wing British voters, that do not understand why a British Prime Minister is not willing to stand up for an international rules-based order and is not willing to defend national sovereignty?
Well, what I would say to my right honourable friend is that the support for a rules-based international order and for international law is a central part of our foreign policy and the decisions that the UK government makes and the actions that we take. There is an approach which says that, look, this is a new world of great power politics and spheres of influence and which rejects the role for the international law. That is not our view, not only because we believe this is right, it is part of our values and part of our progressive values, but also because it is in UK interests as well to do so. It's why we believe not just in the UN Charter, but also more broadly in international law and a rules-based framework as well. But it's also why we believe in rules-based alliances and the maintenance of those alliances. And contrary to the approach of the sort of great power strategic hemispheres, we believe in the transatlantic alliance and the NATO alliance. That is why we're taking such a strong position on Greenland and Denmark, but it is also why we work with close allies and talk to them on many issues privately as well as publicly.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
At the end of the Foreign Secretary's statement, I'm no wiser as to whether the government approves this action and believes or does not believe that whether it breaks international law. Now, the Prime Minister is such a devotee of international law that he's not prepared to defend our own borders from the small boats and take the necessary action.
Correct.
Why is it that there's one law for the American president doing what is right for his country and defending his country, but there's a different law from us? So the simple question is, does the government believe this breaks international law? Does it approve this action?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I think, as I said in my statement, as the Prime Minister said on Saturday, there can be no tears shed for the Maduro regime and the damage that it has done over many years. It is for the US to set out the legal position behind their actions. We were not involved in those actions. We continue to be guided by international law in our approach, and we continue to work now for the most important issue, to get transition to peaceful democracy in Venezuela.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was the Prime Minister that decided to disregard the United Nations Charter when it came to Trump's bombing, killing and kidnapping of a head of state. I think it speaks volumes that the Prime Minister has chosen not to come to this House to explain his decision. The reality is this: if it were Putin doing this, the Prime Minister would not be saying, oh, it's up to the Russians to decide whether or not this is legal. But this is exactly what the Prime Minister has said in relation to Trump's disgusting attack on Venezuela. Isn't the reality that the Prime Minister is willing to ditch international law and sidestep the United Nations Charter in order to appease Donald Trump? And doesn't this cowardly, craven approach drag this country's reputation through the dirt?
Secretary.
Well, I just say to the honourable member, I do find it hard to not remember his support and welcoming for the Maduro regime, a regime which is currently being investigated for crimes against humanity.
Sir Jeremy Hunt.
Most people's view of Maduro's capture will be good riddance, and I would have liked the government to be more categoric in supporting US action in removing an illegitimate and evil dictator. But if the new US approach extends to the annexation of Greenland, the sovereign territory of a NATO member, it could mean the end of the alliance with disastrous consequences. So how much planning is going on at the Foreign Office to actually make sure such a disaster doesn't happen? We understand that discussions between allies have to be in private, but what it looks like from the outside is that Europe is weak and divided. So can she reassure the House the right conversations are happening and we are not just hoping for the best?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, let me just reiterate our strong support for the Greenlanders and for Denmark. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and it is the future for Greenland is for them to decide, not for anybody else, notwithstanding any of the things that we have heard the US say or others say as well. We are very clear about that, and I have raised this issue internationally and we will continue to do so, but we are very firm in our view on this point.
Phil Brickell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituents don't mourn the removal of Nicolás Maduro, who oversaw violent repression of his own people, a fraudulent presidential election and horrific human rights abuses for many years. But they are alarmed about the unilateral regime change sought by the Trump administration in order to access Venezuelan oil resources. Two wrongs don't make a right. So what measures is the Foreign Secretary taking to support opposition leaders, including 2025 Nobel Prize winner Maria Corina Machado?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, our country has particularly strong relationships with the Venezuelan opposition as a result of the work of our charge d'affaires and the work of our embassy in Venezuela that we have maintained when other countries have not. As I have said, that does put us in a particularly significant position in terms of being able to support a transition to democracy. That is what we have always argued for, to get that transition to democracy. It is exactly why I have spoken to Maria Corina today and why we will keep in close touch in order to be able to recognise their call as a first step for the end to political repression in Venezuela. That must happen.
Edward Morello.
I will not mourn the passing of the Maduro regime, but I will mourn the passing of the rules-based international order. If we accept the premise that a big power country can do what it wants without any ramifications anywhere in the world, then we accept the behaviour of Putin over the last 2 decades and the behaviour of Xi Jinping in the future. We cannot allow it to stand. And it is clear that our future security lies with closer cooperation with our European allies. So what is she doing to ensure that the UK stands in lockstep with those people that do share our values?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, we have strengthened our relationship with our European partners. Indeed, I've been in touch with the Danish Foreign Minister today exactly on the issue around Greenland. And we will continue to support the rules-based international order, but also the UN Charter and international law. But all I would just say to him is I really would warn members against making equivalence here around what Putin has done in Ukraine, where thousands of children have been kidnapped, where they have invaded a country led by a democratically elected President Zelensky. We should be careful about recognising what we say and the implications of it.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement in what is an incredibly complex international situation. Maduro stole elections, murdered opponents, and 9 million Venezuelans were forced to flee their country. Venezuelans will be both fearful and hopeful for the future. But this episode shows the US shift to the Western Hemisphere, leaving European security more exposed, and US willingness to interfere in foreign states with serious implications for our NATO ally Denmark. So does she agree what the UK can now usefully do is use any influence we have to pursue a transition to democracy for Venezuela, and to learn from this event, accelerating our UK defence and national security commitments?
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend is exactly right about both the fear and hope felt by many people in Venezuela. That is the views that we have had reflected back to us as well over the weekend too. And that is why we are certainly doing everything we can in the unusual position that we are in, given our experience and relationships, in order to promote and support that transition to a democracy. I do also agree with him about the importance of us increasing our defence investment. It is why we have now the biggest increase in defence investment since the end of the Cold War.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Maduro and Chavez regime was characterised by widespread human rights abuse, criminality and economic destitution, and many Venezuelans are rightly and understandably celebrating its end. But I have to say to the Foreign Secretary that after over half an hour, it is still not clear whether the UK government actually agrees with what has been done. She referred to the discussion taking place in the UN Security Council at the moment. Can she say what the position of the UK will be at that meeting?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I set out our position at the beginning of the statement, which is that we supported and have long supported a peaceful transition to a democracy from an authoritarian regime. We shed no tears for the removal of the Maduro, but we also want to see the establishment of a democracy and a transition, a peaceful transition to a democracy, which we do not yet have in Venezuela. That is what we will work towards, and we will always argue for the upholding of international law.
Members will be aware that there are very many of you wishing to contribute to this statement. There's another statement to come and an important debate later. Please, can I encourage you to make questions short? Tan Singh Desi.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, whether it's Venezuela, Greenland, Ukraine, Palestine or Taiwan, the UK government is right to champion international law, but we must face facts. The global rules-based order is crumbling before our eyes as increasingly nations disregard those rules and national interest trumps long-standing alliances. And in this new era of strongman politics, whether we like it or not, military strength is the ultimate guarantor of our security and sovereignty. So, Secretary of State, what steps are the government taking to accelerate investment in defence and send a clear signal so that we are respected by both friend and foe globally?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is right to say, and I said in a speech just before Christmas, that the global rules-based order is under pressure from different directions. However, we believe it remains important. It is particularly important, and it is in our interests and the nature of our country and history. It is in our interest, but it is also a fundamental part of our values. And we believe that the international law and the rules-based order are fundamentally a foundation for peace and security across the world. We do have to engage with the world as we find it, not as we would like it to be. That does mean continuing to advocate for international law, both with people right across the world, including directly with our allies, but it also means increasing our investment in defence, because fundamentally protecting our national security has to be the most important priority for the government.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Surely the real story coming out today and over the last few days is the revelation that we should all have known, that this country has opted out of protecting in the international rules-based system. We have not significantly invested in defence, and even the commitment that the Foreign Secretary speaks of does not keep pace with defence inflation. So doesn't this really reveal a simple truth? That, as the Prime Minister revealed on Sunday, he hasn't even spoken to the American President. The Americans did it without us because the Americans don't give a damn